Hey, we are back. Next on the agenda, we've got the good Mr. Perfect back up. So Todd, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll ask Kyle Wentland, who's our Land Quality Division Administrator, to maybe come up and do an assist on the presentation. So the first item on the agenda was to develop responses to the Wyoming Mining Association's letter dated June 12th, 2023. We did that, and I just want to give some quick highlights of what's in that letter. And then have Mr. Wentland maybe talk about some of the responses that we prepared. So first off, and I'll also say that Mr. Detai with the Mining Association will correct anything that I may get not perfectly correct here. So first off, when we looked at the letter, there were 4 primary categories as we saw it, which was the first being agency staffing and compensation. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next topic, but generally agree with the assessment of the Mining Association in that regard. And it really is affected by the Air Quality Division, which we've talked about in previous meetings, but also with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission program under the Land Quality Division and the health physicist positions. But the second item, large item, was on dual regulation and permitting. The third, drilling notifications, and the fourth major category was on coal reporting and bonding. So when we look into this, you see with the agency staffing and compensation, the first 8 comments in their letter really address this topic. And it's not just with the staffing. Some of it is about where we're putting our resources and the priorities on permitting versus on meeting other obligations of the agency, such as public records requests. There's some concern about the pace of the conversion from paper permitting processes to electronic. And then the priority of the agency on some of the objectives. And I can tell you that, and I think this came up with some of the conversations with the Office of State Lands and Investment, which is looking at the process and how to streamline that process and get rid of unnecessary steps as you go through the permitting or whatever the activity is. And we are anticipating 3 or 4 what's called lean Kaizen efforts, one in land quality, one in water quality, and then one in the solid and hazardous waste division. We're not proposing one this year for the air quality just because we don't have the bandwidth to take that on this year. And then lastly, in that first category is the new federal requirements that are before us, including in air quality and also on some of the other federal programs, and that we need the staffing to be able to review and comment and look out or convey Wyoming's interests in pushing back on some of these federal regulations that don't make sense for Wyoming. Under the second category, the dual regulation, some of this is dual regulation on the federal side of things. So you might have the Department of Interior and EPA having a duplication of efforts. And I would say BLM falls into that category as well. We've seen instances where we've pushed back a little bit on the BLM, where in the past they have tried to assume control over the air quality programs. And so you'd have responsibility to not only report to the oversight agency, would be EPA on the Clean Air Act. They would expand it such that they would have the ability to override our decisions as a primacy state. And we've pushed back on that in the past. the other is related to sage grouse consultation with the Game and Fish, and you have different divisions issuing permits, whether it's an air quality permit and a land quality permit and then a water permit. Do you have to do 3 separate consultations? And the simple answer to that is no. So typically, if the land quality division already has the demonstration from the Game and Fish and has had that consultation, we don't have to repeat that exercise. We just have to have the documentation that we've had the consultation so that we're conforming with the executive order regarding sage grouse. And so we agree with the comment that there shouldn't be a need to do multiple consultations. And I don't know that that's happening. And then on the drilling notifications, there was been expressed some concerns over the review times and the surety bonding timelines. Under the last category, which is coal reporting and bonding, some discussion around making some adjustments to the annual reporting requirement. And I'll leave it to Mr. Wentland to talk about that. The bond calculations and how often we require the updating of the bond calculations. And that's an important topic that I think we can shed some light on. And then I would just kind of wrap up by saying you've got the Wyoming Pollution Discharge Elimination System program, which is equivalent to the federal NPDES program. When you look at industrial stormwater permits, is there an opportunity to embed those into the land quality division permit so that we don't have 2 permits, but rather a single permit that the entity can obtain? And there's some pros and cons to that approach. And then there was a request for a full historical discussion on past legislative and regulatory decisions. And that's one that I would just ask that that's maybe something that the LSO could take on as a project rather than having the agency do that. But anyway, that being said, I think there is just an overall general response is that first, we're going to continue to work with ANI, the budget office, joint appropriations, and the governor's office on recruitment and retention issues. And like I said, that's the next topic, so I'm not going to delve into it too much here. But we also believe that we have a mechanism in place to address the majority of these issues. We regularly participate in the regulatory affairs group with the Mining Association, and we regularly participate in mine sector working groups to discuss solutions to these types of issues. And then lastly, as I mentioned, we're scheduled right now to conduct these lean Kaizen process improvement reviews with the 3 divisions. So with that, what I'd like to do is have Mr. Wentland maybe talk about the annual reports, the bond calculations, or maybe just go over the letter of response that we had provided to the committee.
For that, Director, Mr. Detai asked me a quick question there, so I have to catch up a little bit. But in walking through, maybe we'll go to the drilling notification comment just in following your outline. Is that appropriate, Mr. Chairman?
Sure.
Okay, we do track the drilling notification times. And if you have a copy of the letter, you'll reference the table in the letter. So we're looking at, times over the last 3 years is what we pulled out of our data set, because we do follow this following a lean review that was conducted back in 2017-18. So we do have data on these actions. And what we're seeing is our times. Yes, sir. Could you pull that mic just a little bit closer so the folks can. Mr. Co-Chairman, sure. Thank you. So what we're seeing in those times is, a long time average days in 2021 was 22. Average days in 22 was 20, 23 is 12. Somewhat related to the number of applications we're receiving on those. And then you can see the longest times and sometimes our longer lead times are also because they're coordinated with federal mineral or federal surface, and we have to see those plan of operations or those approvals come through before we can issue our final action on a DN. So I'm not sure, in our response, I'm just not sure that we're seeing those deficiencies and the division is meeting its statutory deadlines here and handily, even with the shortage of staff that we've had.
So any follow-up questions or responses to their response?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Travis Detai, Executive Director of the Wyoming Mining Association. I've had follow-up conversations on this with Director Parfit, and we are experiencing with some of our, specifically with some of our newer industries coming into the state, some timeline issues as opposed to when they put their notification in and getting on their timetable for when they're allowed to drill. And the director has visited with me, and we're going to talk further on that and try to resolve the issue between us.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Just a question for any one of the three of you, I guess. Director, you were saying when I come in for a permit and I've already been to Game and Fish and I've already gone with them through my application. I don't have to duplicate that with you. When I walk in, do I get a sheet of paper or get some sort of direction that I know that coming in? Do I, as the applicant, do I have to wait for someone to tell me that? Or is that something that when I get my sheet of what I need to provide you, it says I don't need to provide this, I just need to provide a copy of what I submitted to Game and Fish? Is there just like a listing of that?
Mr. Chairman, for land quality, I can answer that question. We have guidance documents for them that we can provide them in advance. And we're also open to a pre-application meeting, which we do quite regular, to make sure that these folks come in with what they need to have.
So if I can follow up, and that's the type of thing when we talk about time is money, when you're coming in for these applications, that if I'm the applicant, I know that going in, so I don't have to wait and then turn in all this and then say, well, you didn't need to do that, or you have to do this, that there's more that's out there. So a pre-application conference, that sounds like, and then for Mr. Detai, is that your experience in that?
Mr. Chairman, Co-Chairman Guru, I think that's accurate. I would like to note, though, just to follow up on my previous comment, what we're seeing with some of the drilling notifications, there are a lot of new people coming into the state that may not quite be familiar with the process and the permitting process. And again, I think, as Director Parfit noted, we do have a mechanism to address these concerns through our WMA industry regulatory working groups, which we invite the DEQ personnel to attend on a regular basis, which gives us kind of a forum to get everybody around the table so that the regulated community and the regulators can get down and hash these things out. And, we don't always agree, and I don't want to give that impression. We don't always agree at all, but 9 times out of 10, we can come to a solution that everybody's amicable with.
And Mr. Chairman, and I would just add that, we choose to have these conversations on a frequent basis so that things don't fester. And so if there's an issue that we're seeing on our end, from the processing standpoint, we can bring that up to the mining association, and likewise the mining association, as individual entities have concerns, that's the opportunity to bring that forward and for us to have those conversations. So I think it's been successful to date.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Travis, maybe you could jump in on this too, or whoever could answer the question, but it seems to me uranium is coming back, and there's a lot of activity, not only on the in situ mines, which is Of course, out there, the permitting has already been completed, but for the exploratory type work that's going on, and they have the net disturbance per section. And it seems to me they were arguing whether it's 2% or 5%. But either way, they were trying to calculate roads as part of that and different things. And so you weren't really able to get to your sites to drill your exploratory hole. What's going on with that? Is that still an issue out there where you can't even get to a spot because of that net disturbance in these per school section, or not per school section, per section?
Mr. Chairman, former Senator Bebout, you know, I am not quite prepared to answer that. I wish I would have had a uranium guy here with me to answer that question. I'm not seeing that particular. Maybe Mr. Wentland, are you hearing anything that from our uranium guys?
Mr. Chairman and former Senator Bebout. The things that I've heard on that are more related to the BLM plan of operation than it is to the state permit. That's probably the best answer I can give you today is on the net disturbance. Right. Right. So. Mr. Chairman, I would move on to the bonding then, if there aren't any other questions on the drilling notifications. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to fall back to Mr. Dinsmore's testimony in one of your prior hearings as to why the annual report is an annual report. And I concur with his assessment. Actually, Phil's the only one that I can think of right now that's probably been around a little longer than I have and has a little more gray hair and can remember when the programs were stood up and parts of that. And, you know, the difference is by doing that on the coal side, what it did is it protected the permit itself from being reopened completely every 2.5 years for public review and potential litigation. Instead, the annual report is not technically part of the permit, so you're only opening the annual report to that review. I think that was a really important part of that when the program was stood up. Now, backing that comes into the bond calculations. The size and scale of our operations in Wyoming are world-class. The only other places on the face of the planet that you see mines of this size are the Pilbara region in Western Australia and potentially some of the South African operations. So the bonding component on these is large because of that size and scale. It's a unique challenge to that. And the annual report allows us to do that bond up or down annually to the company. And what I would say to that is where we've been in the last few years is the division has worked very hard to right-size these bonds following the federal bankruptcies in coal. And of the kind of the top hit list of large money items, we did what's called a shovel share, or where you have a company that may own 2 mines. And when they move into reclamation, they can move that shovel between the 2 mines rather than having to purchase that shovel for reclamation for each mine. Because the useful life of a shovel is about 14 years on average, roughly. And you're looking at 5 to 7 years maximum on dirt movement on these projects. So that maximizes the utility of that particular piece of hardware. That equated for those companies to a $25 million break in their bond right off the top. Then we did a used shovel option, which because of the fleet, we examined the fleet within the state and the availability of that hardware. That's another 12 million on top across the board. We also did a review, an in-state review and study with an in-state consulting firm on productivity numbers related to equipment types. And let's just say a D11 dozer, for example, in the dozer push on a large operation, be it coal or non-coal. when you look at third-party data for that, such as out of the CAT handbook or Mine Watch or Equipment Watch, what those companies are doing is it's a national average. It's not typically the soft material that we run in Wyoming. So we develop specific state numbers for that. That equated to a pretty substantial right sizing of those numbers. We developed a diesel fuel rolling average adjustment. We took and looked at real close when the bonds come in now, we look at centroids or where the spoils movement will go to final placement. And those centroids and those haul distances are really have a large impact on the overall costing of the bond. Bottom line, at the end of the day, you're looking at $1 billion in reductions or right sizings of these bonds. Now, we've had inflation increases along the way, et cetera, that play into this. But if you weren't doing that annual calculation, we wouldn't be rebating that money or adjusting the bond appropriately. They would be waiting 2.5 years for those adjustments. I think given the market conditions and CapEx requirements of today's industry, I think they want to see whether that bond's going down or going up every year. I think that's important to the companies. And I think the industry may want to consider, or Travis may want to comment to that, but that also plays into the importance of that annual report. The adjustments aren't necessarily just up. The adjustments can be down equivalently or more. And especially when you start looking at bond releases. So just something to consider when we look at that and why we do it that way. And I would also add to that, that through the working groups that have been referenced here, these are the type of things that we work on with industry every year and try and improve and get right. You know, Guideline 12 was developed in 1996. I was actually one of the original authors of that document, and I hate to say that I've been here that long. But you know, that document has gone over an overhaul annually since that time frame. I mean, there's 30 years of investment and partnership with industry in trying to right size those numbers. So I think that's important. I think that's where we are with those. And I think it's a good balance as to where we are. And I would kind of fall back to Mr. Dinsmore's testimony where he said it's somewhat of a healthy disagreement on this stuff. And it's an ongoing discussion and an ongoing improvement. And I would agree with that statement. I don't know if Mr. Detai would like to follow that up, but. Mr. Chairman, one of the other items in the letter that was a couple things that were of note. One was on the phase 3 and termination of jurisdiction, that there's separate actions within the state, within the process of final bond release on coal. You have to go back in history and remember that when the program was stood up, the major coal industry in Wyoming was still in the checkerboard. It was still your Hanna operations, your Bridger Coal, Black Butte, Kemmer. Those were still your principal operations. The Powder River Basin really had not come back online at this point in time. They were tooling up, but they aren't what they are today in those operations. And due to the split estate law and the complex ownership within that checkerboard, it was decided at the time to separate those actions for the protection of the private landowner. And it's one final check to make sure that you have the mineral estate and the surface estate correct before you sign on the bottom line, because a lot of those original land agreements, and some of those I authored in the middle 90s, had reparation rights for the private landowners. So that's why those were partitioned specifically in Wyoming, was really for protection of the private landowners. If we want to merge those actions, I'm certainly not opposed to it, but I think there's probably a discussion to have on, is that a good requirement to have in place for protection of those landowners? Mr. Chairman, I think that covers the key outline items of the director.
So, Mr. Chairman, yeah, unless there's any other questions,
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess a question to Director Parfit or Mr. Wentland. Is the state solvent now as it related to potential for bankruptcy to be covered in the bonding area as we were exposed some years ago? Do you feel confident that we're in good shape now?
Mr. Chairman, I think we're in a much better position than we were during the bankruptcies of the coal mines. And part of that is to do with the restructuring of the rules pertaining to how we manage the bonds. So self-bonding is still available, but the qualifications for the self-bonding are different than what they used to be. And we think it's more proactive than reactive, because once we saw under the old formula that there was a concern, it was too late in the process. But the restructuring of the bonding rules that the Land Quality Division went through made a huge difference in terms of the risk to the state.
One quick question. Question for Todd. You know, we're seeing the oil and gas side of it where they're really increasing the bonding limits, not so much to protect the state or the feds. They're doing it just to try to drive us out of business. Are you seeing any of that going on within coal or any other minerals that you have bonding on?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I am not, other than there is some activity in the federal level of looking at hard rock mining and bonding requirements associated with that. But we already bond for coal and non-coal. So I'm not sure what the impact will be as the federal agencies move forward with their bonding initiatives.
Mr. Chairman, Director Parfit, if I might follow up on that just a bit. We've had an initial review of the report that was released by the Department of Interior last week regarding the 1872 mine law reform. And of that review, and granted, we've seen it for about 5 days, so we haven't had a lot of time with it, but there are 30 potential legislative actions out of that report that would require some type of congressional action. There are 18 regulatory actions, and there are 17 policy actions. So you've got, you know, of that, the regulatory and policy actions are really probably the most immediately concerning as to what those will look like. But the two key components out of that were they want to change the non-coal mineral from a locatable system to a leasing system. That will add time to the process. Just ask Cole, and I'm sure Ms. Torski can answer that question for you on your committee. The second item was adding a royalty between 4% and 8% on those minerals with changing it to a leasing action. Those are the things that we certainly have great concern over. Mr. Chairman, the report was released on the 11th of September. If you look at the timeline of this administration, do some back calculation, and I mean, I'm speaking off the cuff here, but if they want to avoid any Congressional Review Act type options, they're going to have to act probably starting in December or sooner.
Any further questions on the letter?
Mr.
And,
Chairman, if I
yeah,
could
Travis, do you
kind
have
of,
some responses?
I'd just like to kind of piggyback on that. I hate using that term, but it seems appropriate. This is an excellent exercise with this committee and looking through some of our concerns that we have with the regulatory process at the state level, identifying some of these things, getting them to the agencies, getting a response, because it kind of tees up some work for us to do in our system of our, as we mentioned, our committees and our working groups with the agency, where we can identify and we can address these things, you know, outside of any legislative action. I think that's a good thing. But what that requires also is agency time to do that. The people that are working on these rules and regulations from the agencies are the same ones that are doing our permits as well. So it's adding to their workload. As Administrator Wentland said, and he may be able to speak further to this with the intergovernmental report on opening up the general mining law of 1872. There's a lot coming from Washington, D.C. And I don't think it's an understatement to say this state and this industry is under assault from Washington. Director Parfit was speaking at my annual meeting earlier this year, and he mentioned that coming out of the EPA on the air side alone, there are going to be about 70 new regulations coming out in the next year. That's 70 regulations that air quality staff is going to have to sit and write technical comments on, defend the state's position. And again, those are the same people on the air side that are working in our working groups, that are managing our permits. And I just don't, I think it's, I cannot underemphasize enough, and I don't want to sound like an apologist for the agency, but the amount of work and the juxtaposed against the amount of personnel and time, something's got to give. And, you know, it goes back to the personnel thing and to hiring and to getting people on staff, getting them paid well. We're asking more and more of the agency to do the things that we need to do, defend our industry and our state, to manage our permits, and to continue to work with the industry on solving some of the problems we've identified. And I don't have a solution, Mr. Chairman, but I just want the committee to be aware of that. And, you know, whether it's the report on the working group and the mining law of 1872, whether it's BLM, everything coming out of Washington, D.C., by the way, not out of Wyoming with their resource management plans in Rock Springs, in Buffalo. You know, this is where this is coming from, and it's a strategy to shut the industry down. And we've got to have all hands on deck right now. And it really is a tough problem, and you know, prioritizing where we are, because we want our permits processed in a timely amount, in a timely manner. We want to defend against the federal assault coming from Washington, D.C. And we want to continue to work our rules and regulations between the agency and the industry and get results. So I just throw that out there. I didn't mean to get on a soapbox, Mr. Chairman, but I do appreciate this task force, and I appreciate the work you're doing.
Mr. Chairman, if I might, I would follow that up just briefly. It might be important for the committee to just kind of hear on and I don't know how informed everyone is, but just on that workload of the additional items above the day-to-day getting the permits out the door. I don't know how familiar you are with the Buffalo Resource Management Plan, but that was issued, and then they were subsequently sued by the Western Organization of Resource Councils. They had a judge that granted an action to say that you have to do a supplemental EIS and include a no leasing action within the defined mineral boundary of the coal leasing boundary within the Buffalo Resource Management Plan. The agency, we did respond to that. We've been engaged with that. There's been a big lift. So that's kind of a precursor to what you're seeing in the Rock Springs Resource Management Plan. Okay, so now you have that going on. Now you have this intergovernmental report on the 1872 mine law, which is going to influence also that Rock Springs RMP. These are big time elements. These are big lifts, and we're doing our very best to act on those as well as get the day-to-day work done. I don't know if the director would choose to follow that up, but
just other than I would concur is that there's a lot going on the federal side of things, and we need to make sure that we're able to respond and carry Wyoming's interests forward on those proposals.
So Travis, the exercise of you submitting these questions to DEQ and DEQ responding to them is, and I take it that you have at least biannual type meetings with the director to voice your issues and so that, I mean, this isn't the only place where this kind of an review happens.
Mr. Chairman, you're correct. And I would say that this was particularly good because we meet with our coal group monthly, our coal working group, and we are working specific issues right now in that group. And by giving the industry a chance to kind of identify those ones that aren't quite on the radar screen of our working groups to where we can do, I think this particular exercise and you tasking me to get some information to you so that we can bring it out, it just kind of tees up more stuff that we can start working on.
Well, yeah, and so I have two comments on that. One, this committee will continue probably in the next interim. So we could do this again if it has value. But I just want to make sure that there's a system that you can have these discussions on a right, whenever, as needed with Todd and company, so that, we accommodate each other.
Yep, Mr. Chairman, it's there. We have a great working relationship with the agency and our lines of communication are open. I would just simply reemphasize that there's a lot going on. And, by identifying these things, whether it's through this mechanism or something else that bubbles up through industry that I can relate to the agency, anything that we can do to identify these problems, we do have a mechanism to work through a lot of them.
So I have a follow-up for you, Todd, on going through your responses. It looks to me like you spend the equivalent of 1/4 to 1/3 full-time employee doing public records requests when you combine those in man hours or female man hours. What is the charge and cost, or is there any time and cost that you require particularly for larger requests?
So, Mr. Chairman, for electronic document requests, there is a fee, and that was established by the Office of Administrative Hearings, and all the agencies adopted those standards. And I don't recall exactly what the fees are offhand, but we do have fees for that. For paper copies, it would just be the cost of reproduction typically that they would pay for.
So no person hours.
The personnel hours come into effect when you are requesting electronic records. That's the public records requests statute that was passed. I want to say 7 or 8 years ago.
And my understanding is we put some type of fee in there. I just don't remember what it is. And the real question is, how close does it come to paying for itself? If at all. It seems to me that for a large time-driven, you have to review all of the documents, whether be it electronic or not, that there ought to be a performance component and a time-sensitive component. If they don't pay as much, a reprioritization or just a review of how that process works, so we're not overly dedicating man hours.
Yeah. So, Mr. Chairman, I guess the way I would respond to that is that there's a minimum amount. I think it's $180 for the request. If you don't reach that threshold, you don't pay anything over the $180, then they would have to pay. And because in the past we've had very significant records requests, that has helped scale those requests down because of the cost associated with that. So there is some benefit to that. But there are costs for, I think there are 3 categories of staff level that are incorporated in that. Now, again, that's something that may benefit to have a look at, because we're talking 8 years ago, and the cost of those positions has increased over the last couple of years with the salary adjustments that were provided by the legislature.
So in that regard, my question is that something that this committee should look at, or like next interim, or because it goes further than just having the minerals committee can view. It would be for all public records requests of some form or another.
Mr. Chairman, that's correct. And I think it was the Corporations Committee that had taken up the issue previously.
So Hank, would you just make a note that we have that conversation with the chairs of corps? And any other comments on that? Cindy?
Oh. So, Mr. Chairman,
Please.
so the production and construction costs for electronic public records was $15.50 an hour for clerical staff, $30 an hour for IT staff, and $40 an hour for professional staff time. And then you have to exceed the $180 threshold.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a question, who is requesting these public records? I mean, is this some sort of environmental groups or is it just regular people across the state of Wyoming? Could you help me out with that? Thank you.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, it's both. So we receive over 1,000 public records requests at the agency a year. A large number of those are consultants and contractors looking for information so that they can solicit business. The larger ones tend to be the NGOs, organizations that they're wanting to look at a particular topic like regional haze or an air permit of a major size. And so those records requests tend to be larger. Or if there's potential litigation, you might get records requests associated with that. But I would say by and large, I can't remember the figure, but we had done an analysis on this, but it's somewhere around 80% of those records requests are from consultants and contractors.
Okay. Go ahead, Bob.
Chairman, just listening to this, it seems like with the assault that is from our federal government coming down on the state of Wyoming, we need to either man up or shut up. You know, we would seem to me that if we man up, we can defend the state and increase our production, where if we don't man up and just shut up, we're going to lose. Just an observation.
Cindy, do you have a question?
Chairman, I just really wanted to underscore the point made by Mr. Detai. You know, this committee being the regulatory reduction task force, this discussion I feel is extremely germane to, you know, the purview of this committee, because not only are we self-reflecting as far as looking how we can reduce regulation within Wyoming, but we're constant. There's a common theme that I think we've heard at every one of our meeting about the necessity to be pushing back to have additional regulations be thwart upon us. And, you know, whether it's the government or the private sector, we're all experiencing the same challenge. The amount of money that I hear from my members in the business community that they're having to either pay outside attorneys, hiring additional regulatory specialists just to try to keep up on the constant barrage of regulation that requires commenting and, you know, response to, has become a significant portion of many people's budgets, that, you know, there's really no way to absorb that cost and pass it on to your customer. So I just again, like, highlight that this is really something that we need to keep our eye on, and perhaps our work as this task force, we could work with our colleagues, you know, within the state to try to figure out a more coordinated approach to be you know, identifying and developing some expertise on how we manage the time that's needed to respond to these comments. Because thinking back to, you know, the discussion we had with the Office of State Lands this morning, these are not entry-level positions to be able to respond and devote the time and talent and expertise that's needed to, you know, write back on these very, very technical comments. And so to have the resources perhaps developed internally as a state where we can coordinate and be a little bit more efficient in our approach, and then partnering and have these opportunities for dialogue open with the private sector to maybe lean on some of the expertise from our industries, really is the way to, kind of go to what Representative Davis just said, a way for us to man up and really push back to, protect our industries that are the lifeblood of our economy in Wyoming.
Okay. Mr. Co-Chair.
Thanks, Coach. Just to follow up on that, and I guess I'd ask Director, how can, in your view, I mean, you could, and Mr. Detail, you could help too on this. You all are watching this, and I understand it's a great soundbite to say assault on this and war on this and all that. That's great. But now, when we get down to it, instead of waiting until the actions occur, what can we do? And this is just what Ms. Delancey was talking about before, is say, how can we organize a response and say, these are the areas that we see that are coming down the pike, and these are the things, and do our own triage and say, how do we prepare responses now in real time when this is happening? It seems like to me that would be more effective than just waiting and then reacting, because, frankly, and I think all of us in this table, if nothing more than the last 24 hours, have seen sometimes how that works for us. And we just react to something that's happened. And so, or something, when you're in public comment phase. So getting in and mixing it up during the cycle, like I say, specifically, what are the issues and what specific thing, what alternatives can we come up with? And what can we say that, this is what we're doing? I mean, not to get into the philosophy of it necessarily, because that's one that we may have a little trouble with, but just to say in these specific instances, these are things that we think should be looked at and highlighted that we think have a cost that we can't bear. And so how can we do that? Is there a way to work with that? Is this committee is that something that we should be putting on our agenda, as Ms. Delancey just spoke of?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I'll try to address that. Well, first off, we don't always know what's coming down the pike until it happens, because the federal agency is hold away preparing a rule package for public notice. But that being said, we work through several different organizations, one being the Environmental Council of States, which I participate on, which is the 50 state directors of the environmental agencies. Then you have other media organizations for air, for water, solid waste, and for land quality. And so we use those organizations to get in front of the leaders of the various organizations and get a heads up notice of what they're thinking about. And we can preemptively identify some of the concerns that we have. Now, is that terribly effective? In some cases, it can be, and others, it falls on deaf ears, but at least you have the opportunity. The second part of it is that, for example, the air quality, we know that they're going to come out with 70 rules. We don't know the specifics of what's going to be in those rules. We have to actually take the time to review them and then decide which ones we're going to comment on. Is it something that is going to affect Wyoming or not? Then we ignore that one and move on to the next one. But you don't always know what the content is going to be until you're in the public comment timeframe.
Mr. Chairman, may I add on to that, Mr. Chairman? From the industry side, I would agree with Director Parfit. By its nature, it's reactive. We have to know what we're commenting on before we can comment. Traditionally, what we've done from the industry side, when the Mining Association gets its comments on our comments, we're a two-person shop, and I'm no expert. Neither is my associate. We rely on the folks from our operations, our regulatory folks, like Ms. Olson there, to help come up with our comments when we generate them. And when Ms. Olson has to take time to draft some comments on an issue, it's taking away from her time mining coal. And so, that's kind of the way we traditionally do it. And when we get deluged with things that we have to comment on, because it's our philosophy, we have to comment on things. We've got to be on the record. We've got to present the industry position. We're to the point right now to where we're picking and choosing what we're commenting on. And I'm drafting more and more comments that simply say, we associate ourselves with comments of the state of Wyoming, with comments of the National Mining Association, because we don't have the bandwidth on the industry side to respond to everything. So, but by its very nature, it's reactive. We've got to push back. And to Representative Davis's thing, we do push back and we do fight back, but it takes time and it takes personnel, and time is money. And Guru likes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's probably more towards Director Parfett, but it seemed to me that maybe our best course of action at this point in time is to acquire experts, be it attorneys, whoever it may be, to fight these defenses that we need to have. I think it's, and I'm looking forward to stock tips from other people that can predict the future, because I'd like to cash in on that, but I haven't found any of that happening. So I think we can be assured that there, and I'll use the word assault, is going on in the state of Wyoming with the Rock Springs RMP. And I'm sure it's a template for the future, as long as this administration persists, and who knows how long that's going to be. So we have to hire people capable of taking those arguments at a higher level than we have here, say, just locally. We have to hire the best people we can hire. And maybe this is a regulatory expansion protection, but it's something that I think is necessary in the world we live in. We got to ante up, because we're just going to get run over. So I'm all in support of giving ourselves the best chance to defend the state of Wyoming in the future.
Reality of it is, they send out these rules, they don't care what we say. They're going to implement them anyway. When we do rules in the Wyoming legislature, you have reviews, you have a chance to comment. The Federal Register, you don't. Congress doesn't. And so they put these rules out. And so what I think needs to happen, when you look at these, and coming from industry as well, you got to prepare yourself for a lawsuit. So when you do the comments, you're writing the comments like you're going to court, because they're going to just say, we don't care what you say, we're going to do it anyway. So you prepare and you get the groundwork laid. And like we saw with WOTUS, where you go to the SCOTUS, and then you get an opinion that's right and makes sense. To me, that's kind of the way this is going. I don't know if you're seeing that, Todd, but boy, that's what I'm seeing. And these comments, there's an oil and gas industry group out of Denver, Western Alliance, on the conservation rule that the BLM proposed. Their comments were 35 pages long, and I was going to comment. I started reading those comments. What am I going to do other than to say, like Travis says, I agree with them? I mean, it's complicated, but you're setting up so you can go to court. I think what's going on.
Just a follow up. I guess I didn't explain myself very well, but that's absolutely what I was talking about. This is all about lawsuits that we're going to have to fight in court. And that's what the purpose of the person I was talking about would be. Just to be very clear, it's not, I realize it's going to be settled by court, by a court. Thank you.
So, Mr. Chairman, I do want to point out that, yeah, there is some litigation going on. We have, I think right now, or at least in this year, there have been 4 different notices of intent to sue EPA on various topics, and some of it's timing. And my point is that, one, I want to make sure I have a seat at the table. So you hear this thing called sue and settle. And under some of those situations, the state, if they're not a party, they don't have a seat at the table. And then the EPA and the party that brought the suit, they settle it, and then the states are told what the outcome is. So to avoid that, sometimes we will file a notice of intent to sue if they miss their statutory timeline to respond. But in addition to that, you have this situation where you have 70 new rules just in air quality in the next year. And if you're proposing that many new rules and you can't keep up with the existing rules that you have, you can't comment on those or provide feedback to the agency, we're going to approve this or deny it. That to me, that's problematic because we have program amendments that we have sent down to the Department of Interior for our land quality division. And they've been there for 3 years. This is on the wind turbine blades being disposed of in coal mines. That still sits at the Office of Service Mines in Washington, and they've taken no action. And that's problematic because that's a solution to a problem that we all couldn't get behind. So. I don't. I think we're ready to move on to the staffing. Okay. So, Mr. Chairman, so the next topic is an update on the staffing issues. We spoke about this at the last meeting, I believe. Right now, the agency has 24 vacancies, which is a 9% vacancy rate. That is down from the last time we spoke where we had 31 vacancies at 12%. And I would say from a target standpoint, we're always going to have vacancies. You know, we're an agency of 262 people. We're always going to have vacancies. And I think a normal and what we've seen in the past on average, to me, normal would be about 15 vacancies, about 5 to 6% has been the standard. And then I think the metrics that we use to track that would bear that out. Now, the issue has been in air quality, primarily. And in air quality, we have 75 full-time employees. We currently have made a little bit of progress. We have 14 vacancies for a 19% vacancy rate. The last time we spoke, we had 20 vacancies for a 26% vacancy rate. And what's happened since that time is that we've worked from the last time we met was we've worked with A&I, we've worked with the Joint Appropriations Committee, Budget Office, Governor's Office, and we developed what we call a salary adjustment plan for a specific set of positions. And these are your environmental engineers and your environmental natural resource positions at the 8, 9, and 10 level. The 8 would be the entry level. The 10 would be more of a mid-level position. And we have 50 of those 8, 9, and 10s in the air quality division. So of the 75, 50 of them fall into that category. And the strategy that we came up with working with all the various entities was basically a 4-step process. The first thing we wanted to know was what was the difference between the minimum of a pay range and the midpoint, and using the 2022 market salary range. And with that, we created 6 brackets, assuming a 30-year career. So each bracket represents 5 years and would actually represent 1/6 of the delta between the min and the mid. So basically starting to set up a stair-step process because we don't have a step process right now. The second step is that we moved every employee into their appropriate bracket based on their relevant years of experience. So that took care of somewhat of the equity issue rather than making a salary adjustment just for new hires. So then once we've done that, put everybody in the appropriate bracket, and then we'll hire new people in because part of the problem is it's hard to hire somebody with a lot of experience at the minimum for the position. And when the salary adjustments, which were greatly appreciated from the legislature last year, when those went into effect, about 50% of our staff, I don't have the exact number, but it's somewhere around 50% of our staff are at the min for the 2022 pay range. And so from a budget perspective, that limits your ability to offer somebody with more experience a higher salary than what's the budgeted amount. So what we did was we used the vacancy savings to fund this first step. Moving forward, we will have in our, we have in our budget request that was sent to the governor, a request to bring those 50 positions and budget them at the mid. And then that will allow us the flexibility to put, based on the levels or years of experience, put the folks in their appropriate bracket. And creating that step so that when somebody down the road crosses over to the next bracket, they would automatically get a 1/6 of the delta between the mid and the mid salary adjustment. But in no event would they go over the mid for that reason. So that's what we put into place for those 50 positions. I will tell you that we did a survey through the Environmental Council of States. We heard back from 20 states on what their vacancy rates were in air quality. And 12 states responded. Well, of the 20 that responded, 12 states have a 10% or higher vacancy rate, and one state had a 30% vacancy rate. So this isn't just a Wyoming issue. This is a national issue because there's a lot of competition for a limited pool of expertise. And so we're competing with Colorado and with the EPA for, and I say Colorado because we have 75 air quality staff. Colorado has somewhere between 350 and 400, just air quality. And some of that I would term as self-inflicted, but it's not all because of federal rules. We are doing some other things. We're working with the University of Wyoming and also with the Colorado School of Mines, South Dakota School of Mines, to make it known that we do have internships available. I think last year we had 5 or 6 interns in the agency. So we're trying to create that pipeline from the universities to the agency. As far as the impact of the salary adjustments and this strategy that we put in place, I think it's a little early to tell, but we do know that there are at least 1 or 2 instances where somebody decided not to leave as a result of that. So when we talked earlier today about, why are folks not taking these positions or why are they leaving? Compensation's a big part of it, certainly. But you heard the conversation around culture. Culture, we want to make sure we have the right culture, and the right culture in my mind is we as an agency have a responsibility. First and foremost is protection of public health and the environment. But alongside of that, you have to do that in a way that does not impede economic development. And as you do that, the culture is, how do we help the regulated community navigate the rules and be in compliance? That's first and foremost. And that's the culture that we need to strive for. There was a question about how, for Director Scoggin about, how many positions are new, how many have left or positions we don't have. From 2013 to today, we I don't want to say lost, we know what happened to them, but there were around 26 positions that were reverted back for various reasons, because we had some budgetary challenges in some of those years. And that's when I started. So I track it from there. So it wasn't the peak. The peak, I want to say, was somewhere around 2010 or 2011, somewhere in that time frame. But we've also added back some positions because we've added programs. So we added 6 positions for the uranium recovery program. We added, we've added a couple of positions for the Class 6 underground injection control program, once we receive primacy for that. And so, yeah, there's ups and there's downs because the coal bed methane, as that began to wane, then some of those positions were either used for other purposes or they were reverted back. So anyway, there's ongoing discussions. I know that the Department of Administration and Information is having with the governor. And so I'm sure you'll hear more about that in the coming months. I'll just speak real briefly about the uranium recovery program. We did look at the health physicist positions and checked with ANI to see if they were appropriately classified. Because that's always been a challenge, because those are very highly skilled positions. In the private industry, they can they can more than double their salary than what we can do here. But ANI looked at that, and they determined that the classification was appropriate. So we work with the mining association, the uranium industry, to take a look at those positions, and if we can increase their salary within the appropriation amount, then we look to see if we can do that. And we did that actually before this last round of pay or salary adjustments. But right now they're at the minimum for the pay band of where they are now. So we'll be looking at that and probably making an adjustment, but conferring with the mining association and the uranium industry to make sure, because it's a fee program and they pay for those out of their fee. We want to make sure that they're on board if we make such a change. So I'll stop there, I think, and then take any questions.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. The real crux of the matter is how do we really compare to try to figure out what's the right level of staff? You've got a lot of responsibility and they're dumping on us with all these rules, but where is that level? And you try to compare to other states. That sometimes is, it's just apples and oranges. And so you try to find a state that's comparable. I look at AML and compare to other states, what we do with AML. We're the best deal in the country in terms of the number of people we have versus responsibility they have. But are there others? Is there other states out there that they're really, I don't know what they would be that's like Wyoming, but that would give us something to be able to justify up or down. And we went through this before, Mr. Chairman, when we did with the uranium, with the coal bed methane, because it was such a boost and so much activity we added. I thought it was 12 or 14, Bob. But more than that, and then we took them away because coal bed methane went away, and we added back. Is there any kind of a value there to see what other states might be that would not be apples and oranges?
So, Mr. Chairman, Eli, we did take a look at that, and I think you're exactly right. It's apples and oranges because our programs are structured differently, particularly in air quality. Because the federal regulations allow you to set up your state implementation plan rather than following the federal rule. And states chose a different way or different pathways to do that. So I think that's a bit challenging. One of the things that I would say we have to look at is, and what we are looking at is what we project as new rules that will go into place. So you have your existing staff to cover what you have on your plate today. And a lot of that, I don't see much of that going away, if anything, but it is expanding. And as it expands, we have to have the staff then to be able to develop a state implementation plan in the case of air quality, so that it can be Wyoming's air quality plan, because if we don't do it, EPA will, and it'll be a federal implementation plan that we have to live with. So, so that's one part of it. The other thing is, and I haven't found a good the perfect calculation for this yet, but I think Chairman Nicholas, you had asked about looking at return on investment. Didn't get it for each staff person, but we looked at it. There's through the Environmental Council of States, and it's a little dated, it's 2017. But we looked at that, and for every 20 days that you can take off of the time to permit, adds anywhere from 90 to 180 million of economic activity back to the state. So for every 20 days that you would carve off of the time it takes to issue a permit, you generate anywhere from 90 to 180 million in economic activity. This is for the oil and gas industry, by the way. So again, you have to look at the inputs and how they did that, but it is pretty significant.
You know, Mr. Chairman, one of the things in the private sector, and there's some other gentlemen here that are private sector, is when we would go through tough times, and we've been through a lot of them in Wyoming, we all know about them. And say you have 5 mechanics, but you just can't support 5, but yet you need them to be there. So what you do, you keep 3, you pay them more and ask them to work longer hours. And you just really can't do that in government. I don't know if you've ever thought about something like that. I know we've talked about bonuses and different things, but in the private sector, that's what we were able to do to survive. We cut from say 5 to 3, paid them a little more, and then asked them to do more. And then at the end of the day, we got our work done and saved money.
So, Mr. Chairman, I think on a short-term basis that works. I mean, we have a process where if somebody works additional hours, they can get comp time for that, and that'll carry over. But you can only do that for so long, and then the staff get burned out and move on.
Mr. Chairman, on the uranium positions, Director, if I may, I might add a little more color to that for perspective. So the health physicists are a key component. We need to have one basically at all time to run that program. Right now, Idaho isn't where their program's pretty much underwater. So CSU is the only university really in our region that's generating these health physicist positions. When I speak with industry on this, they are recruiting, actively going down to CSU and recruiting juniors with full-time positions upon graduation as a senior for their programs. That's what the competition is for those positions. And we did I've had some discussions with folks even today. You look at the soda ash projects on the books, you look at the rare earth projects on the books, you look at the gold mine west of Cheyenne on the books, you come up to 25 plus environmental engineers or permitting or reclamation specialists that are going to be needed for those entities. That's above and beyond the existing vacancies in industry and at the state. So you get to probably pretty close to 40 personnel that you can see, or FTE, that are going to be needed just to support those activities within the state. And we're all competing for those same bodies. I'm not sure where we're going to get them.
Follow up on that. For example, for air quality, how many students and how many programs does the University of Wyoming create through their current faculty programs?
Mr. Chairman, I can't answer that question. But I know right now we don't have in-state a health physics program or a nuclear engineering program. We don't have, there used to be a disturbed land reclamation program and permitting program within, that's what my degree basically was focused in. I graduated at UW. That degree doesn't exist anymore. So I'm not sure where we're going to get those folks.
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, to your question on the air quality, there is one program through the School of Energy Dr. Murphy. And so and Nancy Veer, I think that's the N on there, but if on the screen. But we do go over to the university and teach classes. Nancy's been over there and worked with Dr. Murphy on that. And that's where we're working to set up that internship pipeline through the university.
So, I mean, this is just an issue that, you know, that the legislature does has some input on, and that is in terms of funding for the various colleges and preparing the next generation of engineers and scientists that we can impact in terms of what is needed. And so as Travis and company, if you sit down and do that analysis and let us understand what is and isn't needed, then we can have this discussion in terms of funding and where dollars go. Eli's pretty familiar with that problem.
You know, Mr. Chairman, I think we have some real opportunity with the University of Wyoming and with the School of Energy Resources, and specifically their new nuclear energy resource center that they've stood up to create some of those programs and maybe a degree program to build that workforce for our uranium industry. I think there are a lot of opportunities out there.
Okay. Okay, anything else, Tom?
No, Mr. Chairman, ready to move on to the next
Okay, let's do that.
topic, which is bonding. And that was discretionary bonding regulations. And before I turn it over to Kyle to try to tackle that, just wanted to give a little bit of background of bonds within the agency itself. So we manage 1,285 separate bonding instruments within 5 divisions of the agency. And the total amount of those bonds is worth 3.4 billion. And the majority of that is in land quality, 2.5 billion of bonds for 881 instruments in land quality. We have 369 million in bonds in water quality, and 218 million in solid and hazardous waste, 176 million in the industrial siting division, and then 109 million in the AML program. And the purpose is really to ensure that we have reclamation and remediation of permitted sites or performance of reclamation projects. Land quality seemed to be where this concern was raised. And we have different bonding requirements depending on the activity. So I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Wendland and talk about the different types of bonding requirements that there are, and hopefully we're hitting where this topic is wanting to go.
Mr. Chairman, the first topic would be on limited mine operations or LMOs. That's a set by statute number. It is a per acre rate. So we really don't have there's no discretion in it. It's you either fall into the how many acres you're going to disturb and what that rate's going to be. I will add to that, we do have a bill with Minerals Committee looking at streamlining actually regulatory reduction for LMOs and small mine, some impacts to that'll be coming before the legislature, and also basically adjusting these rates to the inflationary rates. They haven't been touched since 2014, but there's really not any discretion there. When it comes to the larger operations, we get the annual report. We take a look at that. We go out and do a field inspection. We look at the calculations within the report. And sometimes there's minor errors, sometimes there's not. Sometimes we find things that can even be beneficial to the industry. I know we've found in coal and a couple of sites where we found some haul distances we were able to correct and actually right size correctly for the company, which meant a lower bond for them. But we go through all that process and then we basically come to an agreement on a bond, and then the director sets that bond for the next 12 months through the director's bond letter. And then the company has 45 days to update their bond. We also have guideline 12, which is a methodology, and we talked about that earlier on how that bond's calculated. So there is a format, there's a format that industry's been a partner in and how we develop and calculate that bond. When we get to the drilling notifications, there's for 3 acres or less, it's $2,500 an acre. Again, it's set number. So it's pretty, there's no discretion to it. It's what the number is. And there's no discretion above that 3 acres because it's actual cost. It's based on guideline 12 again, on what that costing is. But where we get some grumbling with industry and our partners there is the mobilization and demobilization costs. And when we're looking at drilling, and let's say up here, because we're in Lander, south of Atlantic City, out in the northern tip of the Red Desert, if we have to go in and do that reclamation, the mobilization and demobilization cost alone often exceeds what the per acre rate is of what it's going to cost to do that work in the field. So that's where we do hear some, like I said, a little bit of grumbling is on those mob and demob, but that comes down to, that's what the cost is. That's what it's going to cost you to get a piece of equipment up there to do the work in those more remote sites. So there's really no discretionary application here. I guess I really didn't have enough information to address that maybe directly, but that's probably the quick summary on this for the committee.
The Minerals has taken up and reviewed the bonding components.
We looked at guideline 12. We've looked at it every year with industry. It's reviewed and updated for inflation, fuel, like the shovel share is a good example. Any of those elements, it's done on an annual basis.
But what you just told us is that on some of them, it's a set amount.
Correct. The LMOs was looked at last in 2014, but the bill that's before minerals is updating those numbers. The drilling notifications one, we have not updated for probably a decade.
Well, then the question is, does it need revised? And if so,
We're certainly open to talking with industry on what that number should be. And bringing that forward. But at this point, we felt on the 3 acres or less that's probably, we're still short probably mob and demob, but those are much smaller operations. We're open to looking at that, Mr. Chairman.
okay, Todd, go.
Chairman, on the drilling notifications, I just might suggest that if the mining association and DEQ got together, we could come back to this committee with a recommendation after we've had a chance to visit on it.
That okay with you, Travis?
Mr. Chairman, that sounds fine.
Okay, we appreciate it. Okay, next. Any comments on as we proceed? Jump in. All right, go ahead.
Chairman, I think we're done.
With bonding, all right.
And I'll just go through this and then Don Newton this year. Getting details. So anyway, so the process begins by finding professional service firms that meet the requirement that they have to certify that they comply with the resident firm requirements in the statute 9-2-1028. And essentially, and this is for engineering, architectural, and land surveying services. They're required to have a Wyoming office, and 50% or more of their workforce has to be, of the work must be performed by staff that work in Wyoming.
Can you live in Wyoming and work remotely from Arizona?
Not if you work for the DEQ. Okay, so the second step is that, we assign a project manager, they prepare a scope of work, a professional services contract, and this all comes off of a basic template. And then they collect other background information that's relevant to the particular project. Then we have a 3-member selection committee, which also includes the project manager. And then the committee prepares a rating sheet for the project. And that rating sheet is provided to all of those who are submitting a proposal. So they know in advance what the rating criteria is going to be and how much weight will be on each particular topic. And then we publish a legal notice for services, which is published a minimum of 2 consecutive weeks in a paper of statewide circulation. Interested firms then are required to register with the Wyoming State Construction Public Purchase website. And that's where they get the procurement package, and that's where they submit their statement of interest and qualifications. So in the first round, the statement of qualifications is reviewed and ranked individually or independently by the committee. And then the top 3 or 4 candidates are scheduled for an in-person interview. And then from there, Wyoming State Construction delivers the RFPs to the division department in accordance with the requirements listed in the RFP. And then each member independently scores and ranks each of the requests for proposals using the prepared scoring sheet. Then the 3 firms with the highest overall scores are identified. And again, like I said, they come in for a personal interview. And then each team member independently again ranks each firm after their in-person interview. They tabulate the scores. And then the firm with the highest score is invited to negotiate a professional services contract. So it's not a given. And so we as an agency then reserve the right to negotiate the fee schedule. That was part of their proposal. If we can't reach an agreement regarding the hourly rates, then we can go to the second highest scoring firm and make an offer to them and start that process with them. So that's in a nutshell, kind of the process for the request for proposals. Don will be happy to take any questions that you have.
Questions? Go ahead, Bob.
Chairman, is there any in-state preference for these proposals? Do they wait, or is everything out of state, I guess is the question.
So, Mr. Chairman, I'll start and let Don clean up, but that's part of the requirement that you have to have an office in Wyoming, and then 50% of the workforce has to be in Wyoming. And Don, is there anything else beyond that?
It's 50% of the work, so 50% of the cost of the engineering services has to be done in state. And that's state law. So there's no preference like there is for construction contracts. So, we might get out of state contractors. They're bidding on, constructing, and that the contractors in state have a 5% preference, but not in engineering services. They don't, because they're not allowed if they're out of state.
Sure. Just to follow up on good representative from Sweetwater, Carbon County, I guess he is. What's the how do you when you say office, they have to have an office in the state? Is there more detail on what that means exactly? Is it just an address at a post office box, or do they have to have a brick and mortar location? Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, they have to reside in Wyoming if they're going to be doing the work. So they all have an office. It's not a post office box. So we expect them to live in Wyoming and to have a physical office. As far as I know, everybody we work with has a physical office in Wyoming. And that law actually generated a few more firms moving into the state because they wanted the work. They wanted to, apply for the work.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, with the engineering situation, they're excluded unless they have 50% of their workforce here in the state of Wyoming.
At a minimum.
Okay, sure. So the follow up with that is that really in our best interest? I mean, have we had issues in the past that frankly, the engineering costs were outrageous, let's say, in this is a scenario, and that we've caused this to happen because we require this 50% of the workforce state of Wyoming, or has it not been a problem in the past on this type of restriction for engineering? I'd like to know, is there some sort of middle ground, or your thoughts about how about you'd say you can't exceed the other low cost bidder by 50%? You can't be more differential than that. So
that seems like a couple of questions. And I think the first one is, has it been a problem? And I think within AML, we were a little apprehensive about that when the new law passed, because what if there's no one within the state that has the expertise to do a particular project? That has not been an issue. I think there may be provisions within the law that if there's no one within the state that can do the work, that you can go out of state. We hadn't had to do that because we have a lot of, the AML program has been going on for over 40 years. And we have engineering companies that have worked for us for over 30 years that, maybe even longer. So we hadn't had that issue that I know of. I've only been in this seat for 2.5 years. So if that was an issue in the past, I'm not aware of it.
Yeah, it has been an issue in the past, but not necessarily with what Don's talking about with AML, but it was like with architects and engineers designing programs for schools and those different things where they would, like someone mentioned over here, they have an LLC and put a name outside a building and then do all the work somewhere else. So it has been an issue, and that's why that law was changed. About 2 or 3 years ago, maybe 4 years ago, where we put these requirements in to just deal just with that, because it was just these people were coming and saying they're a Wyoming resident contractor as a resident engineer, and they weren't. They were doing all the work outside the state, bringing it in and having a shingle out there and saying, now we should be able to compete with like someone from Sweetwater County, like JFC used to be over there, some of that. That's what brought it all about. But it was a problem.
Okay, seeing none. All right, Todd, next.
I think that concludes our part of this agenda.
All right. So any public comment on what we just completed? We'll get it while it's hot. Seeing none, we'll close public comment. Next up. Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. Come on up, Tom. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Tom Kropatch. I'm the Oil and Gas Supervisor for the Wyoming Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. I previously provided a kind of detailed document to the task force to detail disposal wells in the Class 2 UIC program. So I'm not going to really dive into all of those details. I think what I'll start with.
It helped me fall asleep the other night.
Yeah. kept me up to write it. So glad one of us got something out of it. Mr. Chairman, I think I'll just touch on a few highlights on the permitting process that maybe weren't detailed in there and jump into maybe the numbers of disposal wells we have, time frame for applications and those kind of things. But to begin with, the commission received primacy from EPA for this program in 1982. And since that time, there really haven't been any significant changes to the rules at the commission on that program. But the biggest thing we did a few years ago was this added the ability for the commission to approve commercial disposal wells. Previously, that authorization resided with the DEQ, where they had to be permitted as Class 1 disposal wells. So that was probably really the only major change within the program at the commission since 1982. But to focus on disposal, well, maybe just one more piece of background. There's 3 types of Class 2 wells. We're focused on disposal wells here today, but Wyoming also has injection wells, as you could imagine, for increased production of oil and gas. One other category in there is liquid hydrocarbon storage wells. Wyoming has none of those types of wells in the state. Those would be mostly associated with the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. We do have natural gas storage wells in the state. Those are regulated completely outside of the UIC program altogether, not part of this at all. So just a little more background there. So for a disposal well, when the application comes into the commission, it starts as an application for a commission hearing, and Chapter 4, Sections 5 and 12 of our rules relate to the requirements of what needs to be in those applications. But the application comes in as an application for a disposal well, and then if necessary also for an aquifer exemption. We have a 60-day application period. So the applications are required approximately 60 days before the actual hearing would be scheduled. And that time frame stems from the requirements we have for public notice of that hearing. If an aquifer exemption is required to be granted, then we have to hold, under the federal rules, we have to hold a public meeting and accept public comment. And so some of that information and the notice requirements for that require that 60-day application period. An aquifer exemption is necessary for a disposal well if the intended injection zone qualifies as an underground source of drinking water. An underground source of drinking water is defined as an aquifer that supplies a public water supply or has the quantity sufficient to supply a public water supply and is currently being used for any other domestic or human consumption. So if someone else has a domestic well in there, or most common in Wyoming, it has the quantity to provide a public water supply, and the TDS, or the total dissolved solids, are less than 10,000 milligrams per liter. And then it could be, cannot be a previously exempted aquifer. So if it was a USDW at one time, but has been exempted, then it is excluded from that USDW designation. So most of those hearing applications for disposal well and aquifer exemption are heard by the commission hearing examiners, which are the agency staff within our USC program. That, as I said, that meeting or that hearing acts as our public meeting, and we will accept public comment at that meeting. And that's the requirement of the EPA for if an aquifer exemption is being granted. Those public comments are evaluated and considered as part of the commission permit review and would be addressed if there's information in there that needs addressed. The testimony at the hearing is usually provided by a landman and a geologist and an engineer, and they provide details related to the disposal well and the aquifer exemption and whether or not those could be granted. One piece of information, I guess there's several criteria that we can grant an aquifer exemption for, and the reason I focus on aquifer exemptions is those significantly increase the time frame for the commission's approval process or the application's approval process. And the ones we grant typically revolve around 2 criteria. Could either be at a depth or location that makes recovery of the water economically or technologically impractical. So it's so deep that someone's not going to drill a water well to that formation because of the cost or because of the technical impracticality of it. And then the other criteria is that the water quality is between 5,000 and 10,000 parts per million or milligrams per liter total dissolved solids, and the water is not reasonably expected to be used for fresh and potable water. And that criteria is actually advantageous to the applicant because when we submit that to EPA, the federal rules require they have that they act on that within 45 days of our submission, or the application is considered to be approved, and EPA's timeframe there would be over. So when we get applications in, as I said, there's about 5 criteria we could use to exempt the aquifer, but we try to have an applicant focus on just one of those, and that one would be the most advantageous to their case. But when they start, many times we get applications that come in with 2 or 3 of the criteria because the formation would qualify. But when that occurs, then EPA looks at all of those criteria and they evaluate each one of them. And it just adds to the length of time for the review that's necessary. So if we could focus on one and that's enough to grant the exemption, then we try to get an applicant to do that. And I also mentioned that last criteria because that is maybe the one point that we're more stringent than federal regulation. Our regulation, again, was if it's between 5,000 and 10,000 milligrams per liter total dissolved solids and not reasonably expected to be used, then we can grant an exemption. The federal regulation is actually between 3,000 and 10,000. So they have a little more leeway on the lower end. You can have a little bit better water quality and still use that criteria for the exemption than what our regulation would allow. Mr. Chairman, then following the hearing, it's common that we need some supplemental information, so we request that from the applicant. Once we receive all of that, the hearing examiner writes an order and makes a recommendation to the commission, and then the commission would approve or take an action on the examiner's recommendation. And at that point, if it's just a disposal well application, if it did not require an aquifer exemption because the formation was not a USDW, then it's considered approved and they can move forward with the disposal into that well. If there is an aquifer exemption required, then the application also must be submitted to EPA at that point, and then they review what the commission action was, and then would either concur with that commission action, or they could overfile or overrule the commission action if they felt we took an inappropriate action with that permit. And so that adds to the time. And so as an example of the workload and the permits we have, from the beginning of 2021 through the middle of 2023, we approved 49 applications for disposal wells. The average time frame from the date of hearing to final approval was 180 days. Average time frame, if we needed supplemental information after we received that, was 112 days with a median of 78 days. So the minimum time that we would have to approve the application is 30 days. Once we have the hearing, make a recommendation, the commission would meet at their next scheduled hearing and approve that recommendation. So that would be 30 days later at the next monthly hearing. When we look at what time the EPA adds, so those numbers, that 180 days is generally the average for any application. If we send it to EPA in 2021 and 2022, their average time for review was 93 days. So it was about half of the average time to review the application. This year in 2023, we've seen that significantly increase. And one of the attachments I provided ahead of time was their additional review this year of environmental justice and climate change actions within the UIC program, which is not found in any federal regulation or found in any state regulation, but they decided this year that they were going to add that type of review. So the average time frame we had received early September, when I put this information together, we had received 3 approvals from EPA on the 21 applications we had submitted to them for this year. They averaged 186 days for time for review this year instead of their average of 90 in previous years. And we actually have more sitting there. We've received another 7 approvals from EPA in the last couple of weeks since I've prepared this information, and have 11 pending. And those 11 that are still pending at EPA averaged 284 days, or they've been there now for an average of 284 days. So this additional EJ and climate change review that they've done has really added significant portion of time. And we've put significant pushback on EPA this year on that. They told us they were doing it. We would call and email consistently to ask where that was and also to inform them we felt it wasn't part of the program and that they had no authority to do it in the first place. But they were doing it anyway. And the only application that we have any real teeth in the matter is those where they have that 45-day requirement in the federal law to review those. And the reality with that is they can easily circumvent the 45 days. They'll just respond with questions on the application, and that stops the clock until we can respond with an answer with more data or whatever they might ask a question about. Once we receive those, we also, and we're able to review what the review was that they undertook within those in EJ and climate change. We also pushed back with the idea that when we exempt an aquifer, we have to show that there is no current use and that no one in the future will use that aquifer for drinking water. That's how we can exempt it. That's by definition, we show there is no current or future use for that aquifer. So how can it have any impact then on EJ or any other community or on climate change if there is no future use for that aquifer? So I think that might have struck a little note with them. They did take that to heart and said they would get back to us on our comments related to that. We have not heard back at this point in time, but we do continue to evaluate any options we have with that, whether that rises to a level of a lawsuit against EPA for taking actions that are outside what the law says they can do. We continue just to evaluate those. So in addition, in 2023 to the 21 applications that we've submitted to EPA, we have 20 pending applications in our office. Out of those 20, 14 of them right now have supplemental information requests that we're waiting on the applicant to respond to. And the other 6 are waiting on our staff to prepare the order and either push it on to EPA or have it be fully approved. So, Mr. Chairman, I think running through quickly, that was the information I hope to provide. In addition, I would just answer any questions on that or the previous information I'd submitted.
Questions? So I've got a couple questions. One is that you said that our regulations go from 5,000 to 10,000 total dissolved solids, whereas the feds are 3,000 to 10. We have a draft bill here that 206. It basically says that you can't be more restrictive than the federal guidelines. I mean, what's your take on that?
Mr. Chairman, we could reduce it. I don't know the history of why we selected a different range of concentrations than what was in the original federal regulation. I think it could be easily remedied with a regulation change, and since it wouldn't put us less stringent than the federal regulation by changing it to match theirs, I would imagine they wouldn't have any, similar to the way we did commercial disposal wells, they wouldn't have any comments, and we could probably make that change just through a regulation change at the commission.
My next question is on the new review guidelines the EPA has established on their climate change policy review, and that extended almost doubles the time. Is there an outstanding lawsuit from anywhere around challenging because it's not in rule, right?
Mr. Chairman, as far as I'm aware, in the states I've talked to, we are the first ones that have gone through that new EJ and climate change review. Now, there's been discussion nationwide as it relates to Class 6 permits on that EJ and climate change, well, at least the EJ review for those types of wells, or at least primacy applications for those types of wells. But I was at a meeting last week with a person from EPA headquarters and asked him if it was coming down from headquarters, and he indicated it was not, that it was just a regional issue that they added to it. So I'm not aware of any lawsuits or anyone else that have actually gone through that yet, but I think it will be coming from more places now.
So have you had this discussion with the AG or the chief executive's office and issuing a notice of suit?
Mr. Chairman, we've started that discussion to indicate our concern. We haven't had a full discussion of and let them review what is in that detail and where it could go. But our internal Attorney General representative is aware, and we are pursuing, an avenue like that. If
Well, and it would be useful if you could demonstrate what the impacts are of that. Doubling the time period and the impacts on the private industry, so that if there are substantial impacts, then we can help push that ball up the hill.
And Mr. Chairman, I will say once that first one came out, the subsequent applications have moved quicker. I think, it took them a while to develop that first one and the guidelines that they're using to review those within. Hopefully we'll see that quicker in the future, but I agree that it's not within the law and it shouldn't even be a burden placed on these types of applications. So.
Okay, other questions for Tom? Bob, go ahead. Pass the picture.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here today. You're relatively new, I think. Wasn't Watson the oil and gas director in Casper? Yeah.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I've been the supervisor now almost 2 years. Officially, I was deputy director underneath Mr. Watson for about 7 years.
Thank you. Yeah, looking at this climate change, environmental justice, executive orders, it just goes back to everything we've been talking about earlier. We got these, the BLM, EPA, all these 3-letter agencies telling us how to do things here in Wyoming. Sternly worded letters and lawsuits. I think lawsuits is really we're headed on all of this stuff. I don't know what the other avenues are other than non-compliance. I mean, I don't know where that goes. Maybe we change the name of this task force to the Wyoming Non-Compliance Task Force. Just we're running out of options, and it's frustrating to just watch them destroy our industries here in Wyoming. Earlier, the guy from the Wyoming Mining Association, he was on his soapbox, and I get it. I mean, every committee meeting that I go to now, it seems like that's all we're talking about is government overreach on everything that's happening in our state right now. And when that ends, maybe with the turnover of an administration, but thank you for your comments today and bringing us this more overreach for Wyoming, just to see how it's coming from all directions. I don't know where we go. Pitchforks and torches, maybe. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, you did a great job outlining this process and everything like that, but what do you see from your point of view that we can do to help streamline this for industries out there? And from our perspective on the state side, is there some steps we can take going forth to help them in the process?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Davis, I think, the first thing is to align our regulations with the federal regulations. So it, in that one spot, so it does match and provides a little more opportunity for applicants who do have to do an aquifer exemption to use that criteria that is the most advantageous in their application, so that it does at least put a time frame on EPA and gives us an ability to put pressure on them to look at that within that time frame. And like I said, they can easily circumvent those, but it does allow us to at least have some teeth in our pressure versus just calling them and asking them when they're going to get to the application, which is what happens on many of the other criteria where there isn't a time frame for EPA to have to look at those. I also think just making sure the applicants know some of those details. Don't ask for an exemption based on all 5 criteria. Even if your project does qualify in any of those 5, pick the one that is the best, so that we're looking at a set of data from one criteria and not allowing EPA to find fault with several of them, which then holds the application up until they can get data to move forward with each of those. Because
Well,
if you
Tom,
give them all,
I would presume that would be a phone call from your office the minute it hit your desk. Say, would you mind resubmitting? And here's why.
Mr. Chairman, it has become that. It has become, and luckily there's maybe a half a dozen consulting engineers, geologists that typically work on these applications for much of industry. And so, I think they're starting to understand the way to make the application most streamlined through the EPA process. And then, again, just ensuring that it's a complete application as much as possible, because we do still have to ask for a lot of supplemental information on these, even though, some of those parties have been filing these for, many years now.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a question about other states. I assume you talk to your colleagues in other states. Have they been successful countering any of these executive orders from the federal government? How have other states been handling this when you find yourself in disagreement or with an executive order? Could you maybe shed some light on that? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman and Senator Kolb, they do, push back. The threat of lawsuits is the final, or a lawsuit is kind of that final aspect that a state maybe has. One, unique aspect of Wyoming program, especially related to Class 2, is because of the water quality of some of our formations that are the disposal zones. We do many more aquifer exemptions than most other states do. They don't have to follow that process. So it doesn't even go to EPA, and they don't have, that EPA does still have oversight on the disposal well side, but it's mostly for operations and maintenance, as long as we report data on our inspections and, on the ongoing operations of those wells, and then EPA stays out of that. But when they do the aquifer exemption, that then triggers the EPA review of our action. And there's not a lot of other states that do as many aquifer exemptions as we do because of the water quality of the zones that they inject into. So to an extent, we're on a little bit of an island. Some of the other Region 8 states here, Utah, mainly Utah, maybe Montana do some, but not as many. If you go to Texas or New Mexico or some of the other large, North Dakota, some of those large oil and gas producing states, they don't do the aquifer exemptions like we do because of their water quality of their disposal zones.
And a quick question for you. I noticed on page 505 of the background information, one area caught my attention specifically as it relates to, let me find it real quick here. You guys, obviously you mentioned a little bit of your strategy, but my question really, what is your strategy, and or is there a process to combat the growing ESG influences that we're seeing now? I mean, there's all these other areas that are coming, another 3-letter word for you, or acronym in this case. They're wearing us out. What is your strategy from your group to combat that, to allow us facilitation for the future Wyoming?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Conrad, I think similar to how you've heard from Wyoming Mining Association and DEQ in relation to some of those concerns, making sure that we are aware of the federal actions that are ongoing, submitting comments from the agency standpoint so that we have a seat at the table. So as it's been mentioned, there's a lot of federal rules out there right now related to oil and gas as well. And so we're making sure we're submitting comments and addressing the issues we have with those, so that as the federal regulations are finalized, and, should the state file a lawsuit, that we're prepared to do that and have our comments on record so that we can do that.
Great follow up, Mr. Chairman. Great. And I'd call your attention to the first paragraph, the last sentence here. It specifically says that your group will push back on the EPA in doing reviews such as EJ and climate change reviews, which are not found in federal regulations. Are you guys litigating at this point anything, or considering litigation?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Conrad, we are not litigating anything at this point. Well, we are involved in not EJ or climate change. We are involved in some of the litigation the state's doing on leasing, the BLM leasing pauses, for example, the Converse County EIS. I have submitted declarations in support of those lawsuits. Should this rise in the minds of the AG's office and the governor's office to file a lawsuit on this, then obviously we would support that as well with declarations or information as necessary.
And final follow-up, are you guys involved, or do you intend to get involved with the most recent BLM RMP that affects Rock Springs?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Conrad, we will be submitting comments related to that RMP. We also are submitting comments Friday on the BLM leasing and bonding regulation that comments are due on Friday. Council on Environmental Quality NEPA regulation comments are due on September 29th, so we're doing those. And also working in conjunction with DEQ on EPA greenhouse gas reporting requirement regulation right now. So there's 4 of them open right now that we're involved in on submitting comments on, including the RMP.
Mr. Chairman, back on the Rock Springs RMP. When will you have those comments ready so they could be, obviously, I think time is of the essence, and a lot of people need data. And unfortunately, they've had 12 years to work on it, and we've had a short time to work on it. So when do you think you could come up with said data that we could basically all use?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Cole, likely not for a couple of weeks because of the other federal regulations that are in front of it in our shop. And there's only 2 of us in our agency that have, really the level of technical knowledge on some of these federal regulations or on the RMP to be able to submit comments. The other person is shoulder deep into sage grouse issues right now and is part of the CIGIT team. And so, everybody talked about workload, and the reality is we don't have any more nights or weekends to put onto these comments. It's which ones do next, work on those, and then move to the next one. So that's kind of where we're at.
Yeah, I don't think we have to worry about sage grouse if we don't have any way of doing mineral extraction. Just as a factual observation, they shut us out. We don't have to worry about sage grouse. So I find that kind of a ploy when it comes to the federal government talking about sage grouse when they're in fact going to curtail all access, in my opinion, to these areas for minerals development. And just your opinion. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman and Senator Kolb, I'm not the expert on sage grouse in our agency. We implement the executive order there. My natural resources supervisor is the expert, and I'm sure he'd be willing to comment at a future meeting if there is a topic on sage grouse that he'd like to look at. But
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, thank you. Tom, we've done a lot of these comments in the past on these RMPs, and I can remember visiting with some folks from the BLM, and it was like we have 30,000 that say it's a preferred alternative A is a great idea, which was bad for Wyoming, and we got 400 well-written letters that say it's a good idea, and they go by the numbers. And a lot of those are just environmental activists sending postcards in that say go for preferred alternative 1. They don't even know what it is. Have you seen any change in the BLM lately, or has it gotten worse? But really looking at well thought out comments that, like most of us might write individually, that says, here's why it's a bad idea, rather than just a postcard from an environmental activist group that says, we don't want to do it.
Mr. Chairman and Mr. Bebout, I would agree, I guess, that it's still probably a similar, if you can write good comments that bring up legal arguments that they need to comply with as part of their rulemaking, then I think they'll consider those. If you find those areas where they've taken shortcuts with, regulatory impact analysis or something like that. And so we try to focus on those technical matters that we think that they didn't maybe do the required work on the rulemaking process. And otherwise also to bring up the issues that will impact the state, so that should the state decide to be a part of a lawsuit on one of those rulemakings, that we've brought up the issues and can have a seat at the table to bring those into the lawsuit. So that's where we try to focus our comments. I don't know that we have a whole lot of hope that they would take those comments to heart and change the proposed rule to benefit or in conjunction with the comments that we make, but we need to make sure we put those in there so that in the future, in a potential lawsuit, that we've brought those issues up and raised the issues with the agency.
Mr. Chairman, to kind of shed a little bit more light on this, during the Ag and Select Water meeting, the BLM testified in front of the body, and they had stated that they were not going to consider form letters. They would consider that as one comment. Now, I don't know if I can personally believe the BLM, but that's what they had said. They also had said that they're going to only take substantive comments yet supplied no definition for what that meant. And that was asked of the committee to please supply the list of your definition for those type of comments. And they're only now accepting during the public process in Rock Springs RMP in 3 locations. They're only going to accept in a public comment meeting written comments submitted online, email comments. So they don't even take public comments at a public comment meeting, which just to shed light on what they said was the criteria. That's what they had shared with the committee. I hope that does some help. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, one last, have you solicited, the private sector for help on comment or, and maybe get things from them because they're abreast and they understand everything. You guys are overworked, overwhelmed and stuff like that. Can we grab those comments and compile them into a joint effort on behalf of the Oil and Gas Commission?
Mr. Chairman and Senator or Representative Davis. We can, and in some cases there's, maybe there is clarification necessary, how a regulation might impact industry, that we do go out and just try to help inform us on the comments we're making and whether, if we're not sure what that impact is. But we do, I think, want to make sure from our standpoint that, and from the commission standpoint, that we've submitted our own comments. We do expect that industry through the Petroleum Association or, individually or through other organizations, as Mr. Bebout had mentioned earlier, will submit their own comments as well. But I think from the commission standpoint, we comment from a different perspective and comment from a perspective of the state regulatory agency that I think is unique. And so we want to make sure that we have our own perspective submitted to the federal agency so that they understand how it impacts not just the industry, but also the state regulatory agencies that also have, some say in the matter on the regulation and on the implementation of rules and regulations within the state. And especially Representative Davis, where there's overlap between, the federal mineral estate and the private or the state minerals, which is what we run into so much anymore with horizontal drilling. It's not just what the federal rules are going to do on federal lands, but it's also how they're going to impact the state or the private minerals as well.
Mr. Chairman, just a thought. Tom, your comments and you're going to submit on the RMP, you'll do what's the time frame? It's about a 30 or 60-day window, I believe. Would you share those with members of this regular task force? And we're not going to say we agree with everything you say, but at least we could have some kind of a working document that we could get information from that's factual, and then we could put our own spin on it, and each of us write letters, and just to let the BLM know there's more people than just a few out there that really are concerned about this.
Mr. Chairman and Mr. Bebout, we're happy to provide a copy of any of the comments we submit to the task force on any of the rules that are open now. We'll likely have the Rock Springs RMP comments in a draft form in early October. And so, we do sometimes cut it close to the deadline for submission because of the amount of rules that are out there right now. But I think by October 5th, we're trying to have our comments prepared for the governor's office to review our draft as well. So we should be able to share those with this committee as well.
Chairman, I'm going to take up too much time here. The moratorium they put on federal oil and gas leasing, they opened it back up, then they cut in half, I think I read recently, the leases that they had originally put on there. From your 2-year tenure as the director or the supervisor at the Oil and Gas Commission, what are you seeing on the effect in Wyoming of those policy choices from the federal government? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman and Senator Ide, when you combine the deferrals of all the leases, and so the leases that are actually out there or the parcels that are part of the lease sales, and also the lawsuits on, previously issued leases. It's really becoming difficult for industry to move a rig to a location and know that they're going to be able to drill, have a plan going forward when you sign these rig contracts, maybe for a year, understanding that you're going to have locations for those. It's becoming difficult. And so then it places an additional burden, obviously not just on the industry to try to plan and figure out where they're going to have an available permit to drill, but also on the commission, because then we've got to revise permits so that they can then either avoid a lease, or maybe they have to rework the drilling and spacing unit and pooling and everything else that goes with that to try to avoid the federal lease that didn't get issued, or has has an injunction placed on it because of a lawsuit, or in some cases where there is no injunction, but BLM just won't approve of an APD on that because it is part of a lawsuit, even though it's not had an injunction placed on doing further permitting. So it's really becoming a burden, an additional burden to try to keep industry moving with rigs and available permits to drill.
And with that, the burden, what about the economic burden, rig count, revenue stream? Can you comment on any of that for our state? Thank you.
Mr. Chairman and Senator Hyde, we do have our rig count at this week. I looked at 24, so we're a little ahead of last year. So it's a good number. You look at some of the other states, North Dakota is in the low 30s. So I think we're competitive, but what happens is, the operators in Wyoming compete not just with other operators, but internally within their own divisions for capital to go to the Permian or capital to go to the Bakken. And so when you add the federal burden, the issues of additional permitting requirements, additional costs, additional uncertainty, then it becomes harder to have the capital awarded to Wyoming instead of Permian or Bakken or somewhere else. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
My understanding is you wanted us to take a look at our OSHA rules, specifically our oil and gas well drilling rules, our well service rules, and our well special servicing rules. And to help me out today, because I am not the expert in this, I've got Administrator Jason Wolf online, as well as Karen Beebensee, who is our program manager for OSHA. So if they can be led into the room, I'd appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So when we took a look at these three rules, I think you're absolutely correct. And our OSHA commission and our OSHA team is in full agreement that there are a lot of rules there. There are three rules. They've got multiple chapters in each rules, and there's probably 187 pages of those rules. And there are internal inconsistencies that create problems, not only for industry, but also for enforcement purposes for our OSHA team. So I wanted just to start with telling you what our proposal is, and then we'll go from there and talk about the why for that. I think what we would like to do at this point after consulting with the OSHA Commission is we'd like to go ahead and repeal all three of those rules. And the reason for that is Wyoming is one of just a few states actually that has rules that are specific to oil and gas regulation. The reason for that was in the 80s, the federal OSHA was not doing much with that. Wyoming came in and decided they needed to do that. There were some injuries, there were some fatalities. So Wyoming came in and developed those rules in the 80s. They've not been changed much since then. There was some consideration in 1999, some consideration in 2012, but since then there's not been much. There's only a couple other states, Utah being one of them, California being another one, that do have their own set of rules for oil and gas regulation for OSHA. The rest of the states actually rely on what the federal regulations, what the feds do, federal OSHA does. And that is they look at their CFR and they look at their general duty clause. And under those clauses, along with the consensus standards, that's how they regulate oil and gas through OSHA in other states. That's where we would like to go with these, with our rules, is get rid of our rules and go to that kind of a system in Wyoming. Our OSHA commission, we did meet with them. They are the ones that have the authority to draft rules. We met with them September 8th. They were in favor of this. And we do have members of the industry, of course, on that commission, and they were very much in favor of that. And with that, what I'd like to do is turn it over to Ms. Biebensee to provide additional context around those recommendations for you. Karen?
Thank you, Director Cooley. My name is Karen Biebensee, and I'm the program manager for OSHA in Wyoming. And Mr. Chairman, what I'd like to do is just explain a little bit that the repeal of these oil and gas rules would benefit the industry and the department by aligning the processes and also streamlining the process to help identify hazards in the same way that we do other industries that don't have a specific rule. So we use this constantly to address hazards in industries like healthcare, for example, like workplace violence. So there's not a specific rule, but we can address it through the Code of Federal Regulations, through our 1910, which is our general industry rule, and also our 1926, which is our construction rule, and then using the general duty clause, which allows us to use relevant consensus standards that make sense to the industry. So it would really help us align our processes for both the industry and our department to address the hazards that we find when these rules right now are really outdated. They were a great work of art at the time. They were in place because we were experiencing high fatalities and injury and illnesses with our oil ups and downs. But now they're not relevant, and they reference standards from 1971, 2012, things like that, consensus standards. So by repealing this would allow us to use the same process and the same standards that we have in place now, which makes a lot more sense to the industry. And the industry has been asking for this as well.
Mr. Chairman, we would stand for questions.
So what would be the timing?
Timing to repeal? I think we could get started on that right away. I think it would just go through a regular rules repeal process. I would think that's, I don't know the timing exactly in the statute, 3 to 4 months potentially. They have to go through public comment period and response, but I think 3 to 4 months, I think would be sufficient.
Any questions?
Mr. Chairman, this is Jason Wolf. Sorry, I can't turn my camera on for some reason. But Director, I would just add to that first, since in our statute, the actual OSHA Commission has the rulemaking authority, we would have to have them have a vote on that to repeal the rule, and then go promulgate through our rule process to repeal it.
Thanks, Jason.
Go ahead, John.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a general question. Do you spend any staff time with these regulations, you wish to have it repealed, or are they just kind of sitting there and not been used for a very long time? What is your, I guess, your the time spent on these rules, if there is any, on the ones you wish to repeal?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Kolb, are you asking how often are they utilized in order for enforcement purposes? Ms. Bebency, can you respond to that?
Absolutely. Mr. Chairman, we use these rules quite often to address all sorts of oil and gas complaints, but they're very hard. So we oftentimes look to how can we make these better, but we are stuck with using what's in place. And because these standards have outdated consensus standards, we're not able to use anything else. So our hands are tied to address a hazard in a way that makes sense. And we spend a lot of time trying to address it through our standard, through these rules. And I would say, especially when we go through a boom time, we spend a significant amount of resource and time trying to address hazards with outdated rules.
Mr. Chairman, if I could follow up on that as well, I would say that there was they started down this road in 2019 to really take the rules and try to mesh them together so there weren't the conflicts that there are now. That they weren't looking at repeal then, they were looking at more taking the conflicts out of them because of some staffing turnover. And then we had the pandemic, that got put to the back burner. But this has been an ongoing issue that they've been struggling with.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Question, Director Cooley, just an optics question. Is there any concern about the optics as this may present in terms of production over safety as it relates to the workers in the field?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Conrad, that's an excellent question, but I think through education and through working with the commission, we can make it very clear that it's not a lessening of the standard. It's not a lessening of the safety precautions. It's really just making them more consistent for industry, but providing the same protections that federal OSHA does, which with our state OSHA can be more restrictive and more protective, but it can't be less. Right now, it's probably about the same. So I think the restrictions are going to be the same now as they are the same with the repealed rules as they are now.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Go ahead. Comments? Go ahead, Elon.
Mr. Chairman, can I ask a question that would help small employers? Sure. Is that all right? Jason, are you still there?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Bebot, yes, sir.
Yeah. The question I have, Jason, for workers' comp, the actuarial soundness of our fund, is it strong enough that we could give a rate holiday to the employers of Wyoming? Or are we in an area that we need to continue to build it?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Bebout, or former Senator Bebout, I think we're going to do one better than just a rate holiday. We are currently working with the Joint Appropriations Committee on a potential solution for that. You're familiar with the way that we've historically calculated rates, where we typically only consider the amount of investment income on the lost reserves. This potential revamp of the rate calculation, which is becoming more of an actuarial industry standard, would allow us to consider the investment income on what we call our surplus, or what we usually refer to as the provision for adverse deviation, or PFAD. So I think it will, I think we meet with the appropriations later in October. And I know that there's some stuff in the works that may help us help employers throughout the state by lowering those rates with this method of calculation.
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, former Senator Bebout, I would also add that we currently have out for public comment, some new base rates with workers' compensation. Those rates will be at current, if it's approved through the process, will be going down and fairly significantly too. So I wanted to throw that out there because things are looking better in that regard right now. So thank you.
Mr. Chairman, just to comment, we've talked a lot today about a lot of different things and a lot of things that are troubling us, not without merit, that have been troubling us about some of our federal partners and things that have happened at the federal level. I've said since the start of this task force that I think a lot of the challenges we face are cultural in government, and that is, I think, at the heart of some of our issues, and that more so necessarily than regulations. Director Cooley and her group, and thank you for your testimony today, is an example, a case in point. And I know we've seen others today, but I am going to single this department out as a department that I think is doing it the right way. Whenever I speak with Director Cooley or Jason or anyone on the staff, I always hear the same thing. We're always talking about the client, the customer. How can we help the client, the customer? And it's a culture that the directors brought to that organization. And I've been there. I was there before when things were a little bit tougher, and not to say that they're always right, not to say that they don't have their challenges, but I really do think that we could all take a page from their book about how they treat their clients and customers. I just had an example just last week where a constituent of mine called, had a problem, had an issue, had to do with workers' comp. And, I just took all the information up, made no comment on it. I just sent it to the director and said, please tell me how I can respond to this constituent. Did not ask for any other consideration other than just how do I respond to it. They dug into it, got me an answer in a timely fashion, and got the answer to the constituent. Not always an answer they like, not always an answer in this particular case it was, but sometimes I do this a few times a year. And I always get a response back in a timely fashion and can get that response back. And I tell you, I think that as we go through, and we've seen examples of that today in the folks up here talking about how we can help with these regulations and how we can help with that culture. But I just wanted to highlight that and thank the director for her work and the team's work. And I do appreciate it. And we look forward to the regulation rollbacks that you're looking at, and look forward to seeing them and taking a look at them. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Senator Grew. Appreciate that. Our team appreciates that. Thank you.
is Bob the Storyteller Bud.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We should have a PowerPoint pop up here and what I intend to do is go through a little bit of the history of where we've been, how we got to where we are and where we are today. And then an update. We have the next meeting of the Sage Grouse implementation team is Friday in Riverton for those who want to stick around and watch paint dry. But there's been quite a process. So ready?
It's up.
Just hit slideshow and from beginning should go. All right, great. Let me just start out a little bit with the history of this issue. So the petitioning to list sage grouse as an endangered species began in 1998. There were eight petitions in 5 years. That at the time led the Governor Geringer to appoint a working group to develop a sage grouse conservation plan. I chaired that. That group started its meetings actually here in Lander in 1999. We ended up with a state management plan, which was put on the books in 2002 or 3. And in 2005, the decision came back on the petitions to list that it was not warranted. There were more rumblings about that. As I said, there were 8 petitions in 5 years. As soon as it was not warranted, they went back to work to start new petitions. That led to the summit, which was held in Casper in 2007. Anticipated that we'd have 40 or 50 people show up. There were over 200 who came to that summit. And in 2007, the court said the decision not warranted was remanded back for reconsideration. So that was our first encounter with the court in Idaho. And in 2008, subsequent to the 2007, Governor Friedenthal appointed a group and asked me to chair it, which is now the Sage Grouse implementation team. He said, we need to have actionable items that we can do that will prevent the need to list the species. And in 2008, the first executive order was issued by Governor Friedenthal. In 2010, the new decision came back and said that the species was warranted but precluded, which means that according to U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, it should be an endangered species, but their priorities are otherwise, and they are not going to act on it at that point. Then, not long after that, there was another lawsuit that said you can't do that because you're basically stalling and you're not listing a species. Came back and told them you have to either list or not list. Go ahead. The executive order was revised in 2010 at the end of Governor Friedenthal's term, and then reissued in 2011 when Governor Mead came in. In 2015, and a key to this was the court and others found throughout this process, Wyoming's strategy was effective. It was what we needed to be doing, but it had to be done on all lands. So the challenge was thrown back to BLM and Forest Service. You have to have a management plan that meets what we are doing in Wyoming. In 2015, those plans were issued. And I'll tell you right out, we did 90 some land use plans in the space of about 18 months. And anybody who thought all 96, I think it was, of those were going to be right was not thinking clearly. So immediately as they came out in 2015, the decision came back not warranted for listing again. So we've been warranted but precluded, not warranted, warranted but precluded, not warranted. In 2019, in 2017, there was a court challenge to the 2015 plan, said they weren't adequate. The judge in that case said, I'm not going to rule that you're right or wrong. I'm just going to hold this in abeyance. And it was an odd deal, but and Mr. Chairman, you can explain this better than I can. He retained jurisdiction over the case, but never decided it. So in a sense, we're in limbo with the 15. At the same time, we were trying to revise the mistakes that were in the 15 plans, which was the 19. So that led to another suit over the 19 plans, and the court, the same court that is holding the 15 in abeyance, said no, they're not adequate. Now, it should be noted that that was the Trump administration, and we worked very hard with them to look at enough alternatives that wouldn't happen. Instead, there were two alternatives in that final EIS. One was the 19 amendments, and the other was the 15 plan. They relied on the notion that because the 15 analyzed 5 different alternatives, they had 6 alternatives, those 5 plus the 19. The court threw that out and said the 19 are no longer good. Then the court went a step further. They said, BLM, you need to redo the 19 plans, and one of your alternatives will be an absolute uber conservation alternative that considers areas of critical environmental concern, that also considers climate change, that considers all of these things that the court laid down. In 2021, the BLM issued a notice of intent to do the planning. In 2023, March, they came to the state and said, here's our initial mapping work, and we'll give you till July to look at these maps and see if you think they're okay. Clearly, given the process we've used, which involves, it's very similar to this committee I'm sitting in front of. It involves members of industry, of agriculture, conservation organizations, the public, the legislature. To mobilize that group in time, we might have panicked. I'm the first one to tell you we screwed it up. We didn't give people adequate notice and time when we started the mapping process. Can't go change that. But since then, we've held numerous public meetings to try and rectify that situation. We went out and did the mapping. A mapping subgroup was appointed in March, late March, by myself at the CIGIT. We got the draft revisions to the local working groups in May. And then in June, we requested and received a longer timeline from the BLM. That comment was extended in August, and just now, I think it's today, is the last day for comments on the mapping. In October of 2023, they are expecting state alternatives and revisions that will include anything that we want to have in the draft EIS, and a tentative release of the draft somewhere in the winter, that January, February, that wherever that is. That's the process that got us here. The troubling or difficult part of this has been that in the past, the state, which has jurisdiction over the species and on our fellow states, took the lead on this and developed strategies based on good science collected in the state, based on local knowledge and engagement with our partners in industry, our local working groups, and people in the field that know where things are. This one's flipped on its head by court order, and the BLM took the initiative, which and set a timeline, which precluded us from doing the kind of process we've always used. So we're trying to shoehorn our process in, and I want to make it really clear. None of this should reflect on the Wyoming BLM. They're not the ones doing this. Sometimes they get information after we do. Sometimes they don't get it at all. This is all being driven out of the DC level. And let's just call it what it is. That's what's happening. So the scope is range wide. That's problematic too. For those who remember the Prebbles Meadow jumping mouse case, what the court came back there and said is you cannot manage endangered species on state lines. So Wyoming can't have a separate plan than our surrounding states if you're looking at the scope range wide. That's problematic in particular if you look at some of the loss of habitat that's occurred in the Great Basin states in the last 5 years. Literally millions of acres lost to wildfire and invasive species. We're in the same boat. We can't say we're different than they are in terms of the evaluation of the process for endangered. And it brings into light the very harsh realities of the Endangered Species Act. Go ahead. So what does it do? There are listing standards. There's the peace policy that you have to go through and look at whether or not certain conditions exist for whether a species should be listed or not be listed. We've been through this more than once. As you know, it's currently not warranted, but the scale of this is unprecedented. It is 11 Western states collectively. The broad distribution of the species makes it difficult. The birds in the Dakotas are very different than the birds in Nevada or on the Nevada, California, the bi-state population, which are very different from those in Washington. If you really want to get to it, the birds in Northeast Wyoming are very different than the birds in Southwest Wyoming, and the habitats are different. And there are diverse threats to the species. There's not a real potential impact from oil and gas in Idaho. There is a tremendous potential impact from renewables in Idaho. So every one of those factors into it. We have two simple goals in Wyoming. One is to preclude the need to list the species, to be able to go in and say, we have management in place, we have habitat, we are restoring habitat, we have the ability to regulate, provide adequate regulatory mechanisms and allow activities like oil and gas, mining, and other agriculture and other activities, and have no harm to the bird. And that's the second objective, which is to maintain the economy of the state of Wyoming. We want to conserve the populations and habitats where we can have the most effect. Not all birds are created equal. We don't have all birds in an area that would be considered a core area, connectivity area, or other. We want to maintain and enhance habitats. We are doing that and have been doing that. I just told someone earlier, our ledger sheet right now, we have, at one point I looked at it, we had about 10,000 acres of disturbance from activity. We had over 1.5 million acres that we had restored or enhanced through programs like the Wildlife Trust and working with Game and Fish with other agencies. We want a sound ecological and economic model for conservation. What we have been doing has been called the greatest conservation effort ever undertaken in North America. And we want to include our major stakeholders in the process. And we have done that since day one. You need three things to be able to win in court or to be able to face off in the process. The first is that you have to have adequate regulatory mechanisms. That includes what we have in place today, and I'll get into those. That also includes candidate conservation agreements with assurances, which private landowners do. And we've got one in the Northeast that includes coal mining, oil and gas, and ranching. There's one being developed in Southwest Wyoming in the Trona Patch, and there currently a new one which would be effective in Northeast Wyoming. You have to show that you have a strategy that avoids conflict first, that minimizes them second, and if you can't avoid them, you have a mitigation strategy. Your legislature took that on about 3 years ago and passed a Wyoming Sage Grouse Compensatory Mitigation Act, which we are operating under today. And you have to remove or ameliorate threats, which is the biological base. The threats, and I'll show them to you in a minute. So how did we do this? We started with the birds we have. This map shows where your density of birds is greatest is in the red. And then the colors grade down to gray from there. You can see where the core areas in Wyoming are. They're where those red circles are. Those are the most productive areas in the state for birds. Secondly, go ahead. So then you look at what are the valid existing rights? What are the uses that are on the landscape? And if you visualize those red dots and now look at these those black dots are wells. Those aren't leases, those are wells. And at the time that we did this in 2008, that was, look at the CBM play up in Northeast Wyoming. You had wells as 40 acre spacing, 20 acre spacing. You had the same thing. If you look to the western side, you can see the Jonah Field. You can see Moxa Arch. Those areas we took out because we said those are already developed. Those are not areas where we're going to prioritize sage grouse. Those are areas where we've prioritized development. Then you go on Then we went back into the local groups and said, okay, did we get it right? So all of these red areas you see were evaluations of habitat overlaid on top of where the birds are to see if you had matched the habitat with the birds and where they live. Take it another step. We then took the vegetation mapping and laid it over the top of where the core areas are. And as you can see, the dark green is the densest sagebrush. It grades out from that. Yes, we did get it right. Again, I think I want you to think of yourselves sitting on a jury and asking, did these guys do the right thing? Did they use the best science? Did they follow what the logic would tell you they should do? And at every step of the way, the answer is yes. So based on what the birds told us, the core areas were developed to include the habitats where we had the highest productivity, and where we lost those areas, or where we didn't have the ability because of other uses, we fudged and picked up the orange. We picked up a little extra to try and make sure that we had areas that we could come back into later and restore. That's happening now. If you look at, there are areas in the state that birds at that time were under, as an example, very intense exploratory and development activities in the oil field. Those areas have now been developed and they're into production phase where there's very little activity. The production is all happening. A lot of it's remote sense. A lot of it doesn't require human presence. There's not active rigs out there. You got production. Not unlike the Salt Creek field, but you have that happening in different parts of the state. So we wanted to make sure we had over 80% of the birds. Right now, we're sitting at about 86%. The strategy is important. We want to maintain what we have. That is the strongest thing we can do, is maintain what we have and not be put in a position. Many of you will recall where we were with black-footed ferrets. You'll recall what got imposed upon us with wolves. You recall what happened with grizzly bears. We wanted to be in a position, and are in a position, to say we've taken care of this species where it wants to live. We've got the best habitats. We have a strategy to protect them, and we have a strategy to continue our economic activities, even in those areas. Go ahead. What are the key threats? I'm not going to go through the chart in the upper corner. That was at the time in 08, 09, 10. That was an assessment that was done, what the key threats are. The first is invasive species, wildfire, those kind of things. But what that all boils down to is habitat fragmentation. And based on the science that we had then, and it has been upheld again and again, you can allow disturbance up to 5% per section. You can have a human activity 1 per 640, no problem, no harm, no foul to the birds. You want to stay 0.6 of a mile from Lex to not disturb the males because they tend to hang around. You can look at that as the buckhorn bar, I guess, for those who went to University of Wyoming. The males all hang around the buckhorn and hope that the hens will come in. There are seasonal provisions, there are time provisions, there are designated corridors for movement. That's one we'll need to talk about in a minute. And then, do you have habitat enhancement? We have both treatment and conservation easements, which are adequate regulatory mechanisms. Well, how do you measure success? It's not the number of birds. And we've had numerous runs at this to say, tell me what number of birds we need to manage to, and we'll do it. That is not an adequate measure. This population cycles up and down. This past year across the western states, birds are up about 15%. In Wyoming, they're up the same. They're not up that much everywhere. Some places they're up as high as 30%. But that's after they went down for 3 successive years. And that's what they do. They respond to any number of factors out there, just as other species do, whether it's drought or it's excessive snowfall or it's cold snaps. Those things affect them. So they're doing this all the time. And any number you pick, where are you going to pick in there? If you pick at the bottom, you're too low. If you pick at the top, you're too high. If you pick in the middle and they go down for a year, what do? Are they endangered? If they go up, what do? So you don't want to use populations. You want to use active leks. Are the birds breeding and acting on the landscape where they have historically? Answer, yes. You want to pick habitat availability. Do they have habitat out there that will sustain the population? The answer is yes. Do they have access to habitats and access genetic transfer? The answer is yes. That's what the core area is set up, and that's how we did it. Do we have adequate regulatory mechanisms? Yes, we do. Director Parfit talked about some of those. Director Kropatch talked about some of those. It's an assessment to say, can we do an activity without harm? What if we don't do anything and the bird is listed? Everything on that map that's colored except the green suddenly is jurisdictional. The blue is what we currently have in core. So you can quickly see it about triples the impact on the state. There's very little left that is not impacted by a listing. What does a listing do? It covers every bird. It isn't populations, it isn't groups, it's every single bird. It would trigger a critical habitat review, which could include all suitable habitat, wherever you have sagebrush. Consultation would be required with Fish and Wildlife on all projects with a federal nexus. And there's very little of this state that doesn't have a federal nexus. Whether it's federal minerals, whether you're crossing a 40 of BLM to put a road in to site a well, whether it's any other federal nexus, that triggers that review. It's all birds in whatever habitat they occupy. So if there's a bird that's not in sagebrush, I had a friend tell me yesterday, they see one most days on their place. They're way out of the range, normal range of sage grouse. And she said, oh, about every third day we see him. He's standing on a well pad. It's a male, and he's out there all summer long. That bird's protected. Bird on the well pad, not in habitat, is still protected. The stipulations and restrictions are far more severe than what we have. And take applies to all birds on all lands, including private lands. Take means by statute, harm or harass. You define that for me. Depends on the court that you make that filing in as to how that gets determined. Is driving by in your truck on your way to hay in the morning and spooking a group of birds off, is that harassing them? Is that harming them? I don't know. It's not defined. And it's 5 years before it can be reviewed. If it's listed, 5 years, it stays listed. So those are the consequences. That's where we are. The service has said that our strategy will work if implemented by all through adequate mechanisms. We have that in place. Where does that put us today? The BLM is issuing a new EIS on sage grouse. The process is maddening in the sense that when we do our process, everybody gets to see it. We're transparent. We have the CIGIT meetings. They're open. We let people comment. The federal process doesn't do that. The people who can see are cooperating agencies, which means the state and those local governments that have petitioned to be a cooperating agency. I can tell you in this process, that process has been flawed. We don't see everything when we need to. We have to throw a fit to get to see it. And then we do, and then we don't know for sure if it'll get changed, but we will continue to demand to see it. We meet weekly now with the other states and with the BLM leadership to try and get to where we have an alternative that we can live with. We've stepped through all of those different steps, and Friday, we're going to walk through the areas that in 2019, the amendment areas, and we're going to go back through each of those things with what we believe is correct to be in an alternative when they issue that draft EIS. The alternative to that is to say, okay, just go ahead and issue your draft EIS. And we've heard this, we'll just issue the draft and we can fix it between there and final. That is absolutely not what we should do as a state. We want our information in the draft. And if they're going to give us 6 weeks to do it, fine, we'll get it done in 6 weeks. We've been meeting almost every day on this to get this done. If we don't have it in there, we're entirely dependent on what they put in. And I will assure you, they're not going to just conjure up our 2019 amendments and say they're good. Well, they're in there. That is an alternative. The court's already said it's no good. So you got 15 in there as an alternative, which has been held in abeyance. You've got 19 that the court has rejected. You have the mandated one from the court that says no, nothing will harm a feather on any bird's head. And you got 2 others. We need to have one of those that we're in, and that's what we're working to do. It isn't a pretty process. I've been through this 3 times. I think that the first 2 times it worked incredibly well. This time it's a different environment. And you've talked about that. I feel good that I don't feel great, but I feel good that I came in and listened to your conversation today because I share your frustration. But we can't throw our hands in the air and say, well, let them do it and we'll sue them. If we don't have strong leg to stand on, the science base that we've used, the alternatives we've provided that will work and have been proven to work, that's where we are today. And I appreciate the time, Mr. Chairman. I hope I didn't overextend it. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Go ahead, Cindy.
Chairman, while we have Mr. Budd here, there were some questions earlier about the mitigation bank. Could Mr. Budd perhaps share, for the newer members of the committee, what that, how that all plays into this?
Mr. Chairman, Ms. Delancey, I didn't hear the questions about the bank, but I can tell you that we had a process in Wyoming. There is one bank that is certified by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service at the Pathfinder Ranch. That was done before Wyoming had mitigation standards. It was grandfathered in if they petitioned to OSLI, Office of State Lands and Investments, which they did. And so that bank is certified in Wyoming and at the federal level. There are other applicants to do banks in the state. I think we have one of those meetings coming up toward the end of the month that will probably be very close to getting another one certified. And then there are 2 others that have been back and forth to be certified as well. The other alternative that exists in our statute is self-directed mitigation. And we have a lot of people interested in that. The thing there that makes it a little difficult is that you have to proffer the mitigation at the same time you get the permit. We don't do the old, I'll pay you a lot of money and we'll call it good. Because I think all of us despise that. And you can't gladly pay you Tuesday for a hamburger today. You have to have a credible mitigation out there and say, there it is. And that would be the mitigation. We're working on another one of those now in northeastern Wyoming. Did that answer the question?
Mr. Chairman, was just for the newer members that were not necessarily familiar with the mitigation bank process and how that ties into all this, Director.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ms. Delancey. The key to the way that this works is that we use an avoid, minimize, and mitigate strategy. If you avoid impacts, no harm, no foul. There's no mitigation required. If you can minimize your impacts to the point where there's no limited or no impact, you don't have a mitigation. If you can't do that, then we have a formula in our statute that says this is how you will figure mitigation. The way that most people do mitigation now is they buy credits in a bank that offsets their impact. So that bank basically guarantees that habitat and that management in perpetuity under a conservation easement and under a management plan that is backed by in this case, they don't use bonds, they actually use cash. It's self-bonding to a degree, except that it's held by a third party and the state is a participant in it. There are numerous protections there. And then they have to have an endowment to maintain their management. So it's a very strict process. And that's what most people have been doing, is buying credits in the bank. There aren't a lot of credits being sold because, frankly, industry in Wyoming has done an exemplary job of avoiding and minimizing. We're still drilling wells in core. There's one, if you go over to Pinedale, you'll see one right along the highway. That's right in the middle of core, but it's permitted because they did the avoidance and minimization. So that's how the bank works.
Hey, Bob.
Chairman, thank you. Almost got beat up by the other Bob. Bob, could you expand on mitigation? Being at the site of the disturbance, what your feelings is on that? If that would be a better tool and how that could work as opposed to banking and then. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Davis, it's a good question and it's one of those that it depends is the answer. And let me explain that. If you look at the Jonah Field, which was the first big mitigation fund in Wyoming that occurred in 2005, I believe, or maybe it was 6, 20-some million dollars was paid into that fund to mitigate for the Jonah Field. One of the things that some demanded was that the mitigation be on site. Think about this. You have an impact to deer and birds because of your activity, which drives the deer and birds out of that area. Now you want to tell me that you're going to mitigate by doing something in the area that you've driven them out of? How does that exactly help those deer? Instead, you'd be better to do local mitigation would be the favored in an area perhaps on the flanks of the Pinedale anticline, that area that those displaced animals could use. That's very sound. In some cases, you can do mitigation on site concurrently with the activity. But a lot of times what the issue is that you basically displace them. You're not killing them. They aren't gone forever. They're displaced for a period of time, particularly with temporary activities like oil and gas. With mining, it's a little different. The displacement may be longer, but you look at what mining has done relative to mitigation. It's been to accelerated reclamation is one of them that they've been doing more recently. That's not only in coal, but it's also in bentonite and uranium. Accelerated reclamation means you're concurrently reclaiming as you're disturbing. So that displacement isn't as far. In other cases, the only alternative may be to protect birds in an area where they're abundant to offset a longer term impact. They all have a place. Preferably, you would mitigate for the animals you're impacting, preferably, but that isn't always possible. To take that to an extreme, there are people who would demand that if you harm nesting habitat, you have to mitigate with nesting habitat. We have parts of the state where we've got lots of nesting habitat. We're short on winter habitat. The proper mitigation would be to mitigate by providing more winter habitat. That gives the birds all 4 seasons of their life and a fighting chance to do better. So mitigation is not as simple as, it's certainly not as simple as I'll write you a check, but it isn't as simple as just, we'll do it on site. We'll go spray some fertilizer on the sagebrush and it'll grow more, and then the deer will like it better. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Mr. Budd, for giving that presentation. That was very informative. I took in a lot there and I have a ton of questions for you, but I just want to ask you one so everybody else has an opportunity here and I'm not hogging up the time. In your expert opinion, how does grazing, or does it not affect the habitat of the sage grouse? That's it. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Ide, grazing, if you looked at that chart up there, improper grazing is a potential threat to sage grouse, and it's way down on the list. Okay. Well-managed grazing is probably at worst neutral. It can be very beneficial. If you target grazing, and I'll try not, this is kind of my nerd space you're getting into, so I'll try not to go there, but you can target grazing to where you're actually providing screening cover for nesting hens until the time they come off the nest. That is a benefit. Okay. You can target grazing to where you do things that improve leader growth on sagebrush that feeds birds in the winter. That's a net benefit. The bottom line is grazing is a minimal impact to sage grouse. Let me make one exception to that. Wild horses. That is not proper grazing. And that is a potential threat. And it's one that we will have analyzed in this round of EIS. It was not properly analyzed in the others.
Questions, further questions?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Mr. Bud, real quickly, whatever materialized or came from the experimental breeding and I don't know, supplanting the others, anything ever happened there?
Mr. Chair, Representative Conrad, I haven't talked to them in probably 3 or 4 months. My understanding, and Senator, Mr. Bebout may have no more than I do, but they've been able to hatch birds and raise them. They got them to breed in captivity. You know, the question now is there a place for release? And in the sage grouse implementation team meetings, which I need to point out that Representative Davis sits on the CIGIT as well. We, at our last meeting, had a conversation about, well, are we at a point where we want to experimentally look at releasing those birds in an area? For instance, we're proposing that one of the core areas, the Douglas core area, not be a core area anymore. There are a limited number of birds there. There are a number of reasons it doesn't meet the definition of a core area. But it might make a great area to release birds where there's a limited number of birds. There's a very low risk of disease transmission or parasites to other birds. We may be at the point where we want to see how they do in the wild. But my understanding is that they were able to breed them and that they were able to get them to survive.
John, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple questions, Director. Oh, you, Mr. Bud. Wild horses, you already went over. That was one of my questions, but fundamentally, what's your opinion about hunting? I mean, I'm confused on why we continue to hunt the bird and we're trying to save the bird. And it doesn't seem logical. So I'd like to hear what you said on that, what your opinion is. And also the captive breeding program for sage grouse. Does it work? What is your analysis of that program that I believe is still going? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Kolb, I don't know any more than what I just said about the captive breeding. They've been able to breed birds and everything, and whether or not we have an opportunity to try a release, that's something I think in the future. I think right now that clouds this EIS. I don't want to necessarily throw that in the middle of this process, but I think it may be time to test that. Relative to hunting has value in the sense that we get data that is incredibly valuable. It is a regulated activity, which means that we can stop it whenever we need to. Do I have reservations personally about it? Yes. Does it, to follow your line of thinking, logically, it seems odd? Yeah, I agree. But is it additive to mortality? It has not been shown to be additive to mortality. We don't hunt birds now in areas, as an example, early on, we did a meeting in the Bighorn Basin, and people up there said, you know, our habitats are really isolated. You'll have a patch of sagebrush the size of this junior high compound and no other sagebrush. If there's birds in there, a pickup load of kids coming out of Hyattville High School can go out there and shoot all those birds and they're gone. And that's right. So you can't hunt there. That's been removed. You can't hunt birds in Northeast Wyoming. They're very limited seasons. They changed the dates. They did that so that you couldn't harvest only young birds. I mean, you were going to harvest equal females and males. The management of hunting, I think, is adequate. But I agree that it's a hard thing to explain. The other thing to think about is if you say, we don't have enough birds to hunt, what have you said?
Yeah, I've heard that from the governor in the past, that point of view, but I still doesn't get around the fact that having less of them because you hunted them is helping the bird population out beyond, I think, your data. I think that's certainly valid, but it sounds like you're on top of this and you're evaluating as we proceed forward in the future.
Mr. Chair, Senator Kolb, it's evaluated every year, and I can assure you it's evaluated very closely.
I got a couple of questions, Bob. First of all, is Wyoming maintaining the best science? Because that was always a key component to what we were doing, and through UW, or what's the process of our
Mr. Chairman, yes, the answer is yes. We probably have more data on sage grouse than anybody in the world. And it's updated annually. We do LEC counts. They're done routinely the same way. There is a very rigorous process that you have to follow. In addition to that, because we have 40% plus of all the birds on the planet, a lot of the research is done here, and we are continuing to fund and do research on what the birds' habits are, what their diet is, what we can do to improve habitat more quickly. That's the restoration and habitat piece there. That's ongoing. That's a great question, and it's one I want to just make this point. In the absence of that, and in the scientific world today, the new thing is modeling. Models are always wrong. Some can be useful, but that's what a lot of people are relying on. And if you look at a lot of what's coming out of U.S. Geological Survey and others, it's models that say, well, we plug in all of this information and it spits out an answer. Well, do you want to fly in an airplane that was built by modeling? Or do you want to actually have a blueprint to look at? Because I ain't getting in a plane with you. We have data, and that's one of the troubling things. If we're not engaged in this process, our data can be taken, should we give it to them, and you can do whatever you want with it and then say, yeah, that's it. The other important part of that is this is the state's wildlife. This is not something another entity, federal or otherwise, needs to be modeling and doing data on. We've got the data, and we're the ones that need to follow up on that. And we do.
So then over, say, since 2015, in terms of number of LECs and the bird counts on LECs, do we have any type of, that's something you can kind of model, or you can at least have trajectories following the ebb and flow of the bird?
Yeah.
Are we maintaining in that regard?
Mr. Chairman, there was a slide here. I was trying not to read every dang slide, but one of them that said, what we really want to look at is trend over time. And that's not a model, that's that trend. Since 15, we've seen 15 was kind of an uptick, and then we've seen a trough, which we came out of. Last year, it kind of stabilized, and this year we came up strongly. That trend line, we just ran them. I haven't seen that final analysis, but we started looking at 10-year trend lines, 20-year trend lines. Instead, what you get are people who say, back when I was a boy, and I can actually say that now, why, they'd darken the sky when you rode your horse through. They'd spook all the horses in the pasture, and there was 1 million birds. Well, nobody counted them. We didn't know that. We don't really have good solid counts until the 80s. So if you take the 80s and just say, okay, that's where we were then, where are we now? Our trend lines from the 80s into the 90s were down. Since then, they've stabilized, and in some cases, they're moving back up. I think that we're at a stable state, but we obviously have to be very rigorous in maintaining what we're doing and stay on top of that. But we're in a pretty good place.
And then going back to your maps, you had Northeast Wyoming where all the coal bed methane wells were. Most of those are abandoned or plugged. So there's no activity. How is the bird doing in that part of the neck of the woods?
Mr. Chairman, the bird's doing pretty darn well. And in fact, that's an area that right now, the CIGIT is looking at a new designation, which would be a stewardship area, tentatively, where the private landowners would enter into candidate conservation agreements and agree to manage and monitor that. Because there are so many prior existing rights there, you're going to have to accommodate a different type of management. And because the birds behave differently there. Most of the people in the room think of sage grouse, you think of Sublette County, you think of Fremont County, where you've got vast expanses of sagebrush and, an open spot, the birds lek there, and then they've got the whole landscape to nest and live their life in. Northeast Wyoming is broken habitat. You'll have patches of sagebrush. There are birds. I've been and seen birds on a lek. You could spit to the nearest well pad The birds lek there, they breed there, and then they disperse, and they may disperse for a considerable distance to get into the sagebrush where they're going to nest, and then they'll use that landscape differently. So it's a different can of worms, but those birds are doing very well.
So you had a discussion, you were going to talk about corridors. But you didn't. So what are the significance of the corridors in terms of?
One of the metrics that is used in determining endangerment is whether or not genetic transmission can occur. That's makes Northeast Wyoming very important, because Northeast Wyoming is the tie into Montana and what's left in the Dakotas. So that's why this stewardship area in Northeast Wyoming takes on a critical, it needs a critical look. There are significant birds there, and that provides that corridor. We also have to be able in a listing decision or in court to show that we're not managing just for state lines. So there's an area proposed in Southwest Wyoming that ties and secures a Utah population of birds, so that those birds have that landscape and not just the Utah piece. We have some of those in the northern part of the state. One is a connectivity area that goes up northeast of Gillette through the Bentonite patch up there. And that one provides another linkage to the Dakotas and to Montana. We have them internal to the state as well. There's one in the central part of the state that links the Bighorn Basin down to the center of Wyoming. Those maintain genetic flow. And that is one of the factors you have to look at in a listing. And it's one of the factors we have to look at if we're litigated.
Okay. Ken, go ahead.
I have a couple of questions, Bob. Number one, do you have an idea of how many CCAAs we currently have in the state? Number two, I think based on the conversation that we've had today, I don't think there's a great amount of confidence that this administration will maybe use science when it comes to listing these birds. Is there a discussion about when if something like that did occur, Wyoming would seek to challenge that decision?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Hamilton, I believe the number of CCAAs in the state right now is 36. Those are scattered around the state. I can't remember the number of acres. Director Miyamoto, do you remember? I think it's like 36,000 acres, maybe more. But there are, I think, 36 CCAAs in the state now. There were a number of those that were done in 2015, 2016, and then they kind of tapered off. Relative to the other question, I think what we're doing is basically setting us up for the inevitable, or at least what appears to be the bent of the current administration. At worst, what we would want to do is petition for a 4D to where we continue management of the species under the ESA. But I can assure you that we would challenge it, given our track record on sage grouse and our track record of management and protection. I don't know that you can do any more for the species than what the state of Wyoming has done. And our results show that it's worked. So the answer to the second is yes.
Okay, go ahead.
Just Director, a question on the I-80 corridor, any large high traffic highway. I know with deer, it seems pretty clear that they are blocked from migrating north to south. And I wondered, how does that impact the birds, or does it? Basically, how far do these birds need to travel for genetic diversity?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Kolb, probably the impact of I-80 on sage grouse has already been felt. In other words, the birds that are north of the highway are north of the highway, the birds that are south are south. It's a wide enough barrier. That doesn't mean a bird can't fly across or whatever, but you don't see a lot of bird carcasses on the interstate. It's also become a corridor for other activities. It is where we routed our transmission lines and said, if you'll do that, that is mitigation. So if you look at Gateway West follows I-80 for much of the way through the state. That's mitigation. Those are all barriers to movement. The birds actually move considerable distances, but it's generally within a neighborhood, if you will. It's not, I don't know, I don't know of any collar studies or anything that show that birds are moving from, Adobe Town north of Wamsutter, that kind of movement. Probably historically there was some of that, but I-80's been there a long time. That's probably precluded that.
Go ahead.
The other tool, Bob, and what's your feelings on these conservation easements that are popping up around the state, and how valuable are those to our going forth?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Davis, they are a adequate regulatory mechanism because they preclude housing development, which is probably right now the number one threat to the bird. They allow for mineral development. They allow for agriculture. And it's important to point out that our core area strategy allows for both of those as well. And there's a whole page in there of de minimis activities that describe agricultural activities that are exempt from any permitting or any requirement. But yeah, they are a credible mechanism. And the only thing I can tell you, I've worked with them a long time. They work for some people, they don't for others. It's a very personal decision made by people who make that on a variety of different things that drive it, but they're effective. Yes.
Okay, I think we'll take any public, okay, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The question I've always had, Bob, is, and I think you've done a good job, and it's hard to determine, is enough enough?
Yeah.
We thought we had it several years ago, and now we more land is involved, and maybe there'll be more later, and you'll never know what could happen, and that's just going to be what it's going to be. The question I have, is there a way we can have exclusions in areas where, you might need some development or something that'll help people that are trying to get out there and do some work? You could have exclusions, allow them to get in there instead of for 3 months a year, they might get in there for 5 months a year or something like that. Being able to do that. And then the other question is, and put it to rest once and for all, is I've heard so much about ravens and the damage with the eggs. Is that really a significant part of what's hurting the population?
So, Mr. Chairman, thank you. I was afraid you weren't going to ask me a question, and I was going to really be worried about that. So,
Don't have to worry about it.
Mr. Bebout, let's deal with the predator one first. That's another area that we have asked to be added to this EIS is predation. We have a committee working with the CIGIT. It's chaired by Commissioner Espy from Carbon County that's looking at predation. Predation is a factor. Let's just be honest. It's a factor. Yes, it is a factor. And in some cases, it is a major factor. Probably the one you particularly zeroed in on is ravens. But corvids of all kinds, ravens, crows, they can become very effective predators, not just of eggs, but of chicks and even adults. If you have an overabundance of any predator in a system, it can tip the system over. And we've seen that with any number. You pick your predator, pick your favorite Northwest Wyoming predator and tell me what's happened with moose or some of those things. So absolutely it can be. And we are addressing that, and we've asked for and have been told it will be addressed in the BLM EIS. The first question, ask it again, because I want to be sure I get it right. You're asking about exclusions. I think, Mr. Chairman, I think what Mr. Bebout is referring to is the mapping effort, which I did want to be sure we got into today. We've gone through, we're now in our 4th iteration of a remapping effort. Every time we've done this, we've gone out and said, what do we know today that's different than what we knew in 2019? What did we know then that was different than 15? What did we know then that was different than 08? What we've found is that there are roughly 7 areas in the state. They're not huge, but there's 7 areas that on average have over 150 males on leks. That is a significant number of birds that we would like to have on our asset side of the ledger. We're not proposing to change the standard, the 5% and the 1/640. We're just simply saying those areas meet the definition of core. There are a number of reasons why those are out there. One, near and dear to me, because I grew up in Sublette County, is the oil field that I described that was in heavy and exploratory and early development that's now mature. Those birds are back, and they're back in big numbers. It's a fairly discrete area, 20,000 acres, 30,000 acres with hundreds of birds in it. We want those on our asset side. That doesn't affect the oil and gas production, doesn't affect the ranching. That's all there. I think the question, Mr. Bebout, that you're trying to get at is if we add a new area, can we recognize that there may be port areas in that will be developed? And the answer is yes, we do that now. The Oregon Basin oil field is in a core area. The Trona Patch is in a core area. There are numerous things within core that are allowed to continue. So I think the answer is yes, with caution. You can't just say it's wide open, but with caution, can we develop in those areas? The answer is yes. The one thing that we don't know yet is renewables. That's one that we know what oil and gas does. It's been studied to death. We know what mining does. It's been studied to death. We don't know for sure what renewables do.
Well, and Mr. Chairman, the editorial comment would be if you can figure out how to get rid of the raven when they're a protected bird, maybe you can do the pelicans as well.
Spoken like a true fisherman, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your time.
All right, public comment on anything that has transpired. Rob, come on up.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and thank the committee for having public comment and having this meeting. My name is Rob Hendry. I'm a rancher up in the middle of Wyoming, out here in Natrona and Fremont and Washakie County. I'm also a dirt contractor in the oil field, but I'm the chairman of the Wyoming Business Alliance. And a lot of our businesses have real concerns. I mean, we represent ranchers, farmers, oil and gas, mining, service companies, energy companies, all of them. And we all have concerns, and you go right on down the list today, state lands, DEQ, oil and gas commission, they all need some help. And they need people to help us in businesses counteract some of this stuff that's coming out of Washington. I'll tell you, Senator Drew said, what are we going to do? Well, the main thing is we need to change this administration. I think Senator Ide said the same thing. That's one thing, but that's down the road another 2 years if we can change it. But we're not going to change some of those heads in Washington. And there is a swamp back there. So it's an uphill battle, but Wyoming does have a nest egg. And I think we do need to hire some people to help with those regulations. It takes money to make money, and our businesses really need the help. I don't think it's growing government, but it's making it easier for our businesses to make a living in this state. And like Director Parfit said, what was it? If you 20 days on a permit could be millions to the state. In one oil and gas field that I do dirt work for out here, it's Aethon. And they've had a lot of permits, 40 some of them in to do injection. And they have to do the injection by September of 24. They got to figure this out. But that one field, because of the water issues, and they can't get the permits, they've got a few out. They can't get them all fast enough. That field is producing 27, 28 million cubic foot a day right now. 3 years ago, it was producing 80 million cubic foot a day. Now, that's a lot of jobs in Fremont County. That's a lot of jobs in Wyoming that's lost. And those are real numbers. I don't know how much money the state of Wyoming is losing because they aren't producing gas. And those are real dollars. So that's a real problem, Mr. Chairman. I think that, the government, this committee can push back all it wants to, but it's going to have to be the full legislature. And you talked about maybe lawsuits and maybe that's the way to go. There was a question to oil and gas about, is he filed any lawsuits? Well, he's not really it'd be great. He's not the one to do it. I think it comes from the legislature. It comes from the governor. I know the governor's dealing with other governors in other states to try to push back. I've heard that. But it's going to take the governor, the legislature to do that. I think you guys will have to take the lead and just not to take too much time, but the sagebrush issue, that's going to affect us all the same way. It's going to cut down the amount of our ability to make a living. And I understand how Bob rolled that out. It was a quick timeline, but boy, there's ranchers, and I'm one of them, that we didn't know this was coming until it was here. And in my area out there and in the four corners of those counties, the bigger lecks there are already in a conservation easement. The Badwater Ranch Conservation Easement. That's where those big lecks are. So they're already protected. We didn't really need to be in the core area, but I had several of the neighbors calling up and said, "Hey, what's going on?" And I appreciate having all the meetings, but boy, it was on rails by the time everybody found out about it. So, I noticed all those landowners would have been good, but timeline just didn't make it work. But I don't know. It's another question was asked about the birds that were raised. They did prove that they raised them in captivity. They proved it. Game and Fish did not want it to happen. They said it couldn't be done. They proved it can be done. Now they're going to try to put them out. We had a weed meeting and a reclamation meeting in Casper for oil and gas, and they're down in Shirley Basin. That company and I think it was the state, reclaimed some of those mines, and they made an artificial lek down there. Well, boy, in my brain, I thought, wow, what a place they could put those birds, maybe put them in a net. The bird man could tell you how to do it up there in Powell. But if they created that lek, well, that's a good place to go try it. Put them out there. So there's a lot of things happening, but I don't know, bottom line, Mr. Chairman, the state is going to have to really get after the federal government, and maybe it's through lawsuits, but we need to help our individual offices, oil and gas, DEQ, state lands. They need to have the people in order to do all these things and answer some of these questions too. So we may need to spend a little money to make a little money. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Is adjourned now because we're nearly 5 o'clock. So we'll, and it looks like we'll, currently we're scheduled to be done earlier tomorrow. So be prepared to address those bills tomorrow. And one of them is actually fairly simple. One of them is a little bit more complicated. The other one's even quite simple. So I don't think they'll take a lot of time and effort. And it's not really our function to work bills in this committee. It's more of what we want to do is talk about the general nature of what they are, whether they're good or they're bad, and move them to, along to the committees that's going to work them at that point anyway. So I think it'll be relatively simple when we get to them. So with that, any other business, Hank, for today?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I would just note that I think, and Director Parfit can speak to this, but I believe that he will not be in attendance tomorrow, and these bills deal with the Department of Environmental Quality. I don't know if that's still true, Director.
So do you have your amendments for your bills that are out there? Have they been circulated?
Mr. Chairman, yes, for the one, for the, no more stringent than the federal regs, I did provide a handout as an alternative to the bill. And in short, we support codifying the existing process that addresses if we have something in a rule that would be more stringent than the federal regulations, just codify that process rather than what's being proposed. And in short, and I apologize, but not being here, but I have some very significant concerns with the proposed bill from the standpoint that it will in all likelihood result in time delays for the oil and gas industry. Primarily because the way that's set up in our state implementation plan, we can be as stringent or more stringent, but we're able to do permitting that doesn't go to through a letter of authorization, that doesn't go through public notice. As this is written, that would likely push those types of oil and gas activities into a process that is lengthier than the one that we enjoy with our current state implementation plan. So that in short is probably my biggest issue or concern. But I would just put out there that I would support codifying the existing process as I presented to the group. Also just say Alan Edwards, who is the deputy director, who's here in the back, can certainly convey those comments that we would have on the proposed bill drafts.
Okay. Alan, you'll be here tomorrow?
Yes.
Okay. So we'll cover those, and yeah, and I've got numerous issues with that particular bill as well. We'll be covering. So clarifying that, but I know other than that, I mean, if the committee's good with that, I think that we're all kind of waning around the ears and ready for dinner. So anything out of the business tomorrow? We start at what time? 8?
Mr. Chairman, tomorrow's scheduled start time is 8:30.
8:30, right? All right. Seeing no objection, we'll adjourn until tomorrow at 8.